This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
It's time to find the truth.
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason, so if you get offended by what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 25 of the Naked Mormonism Podcast. I'm Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. It's been a little while, but we're diving back into the easily accessible deep history of the LDS Church today, and quite frankly, it's gonna be a party. Last time that we were talking about our historical timeline, Ollie, Cowdung, Oliver, Cowdery, PQ'd Parley, Parker, Pratt, Dick, Zyba, Peterson, and Peter Whitmer all made a trip to the edge of the land of the Lamanites. This took the missionary troop from New York through Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and all the way to the very western edge of Missouri. This was a trek of almost 1,100 miles, landing them in the little border town of Independence, Missouri. They also picked up our pal Freddy Willey, or Frederick G. Williams, on their way out to the Lamanite country. He just joined in on the crowd. The beginning of this trip put the missionaries in Mentor, Ohio, meeting with Hinchpin Signe Rigdon, and conducting a few sermons to the congregations that followed Rigdon. Rigdon supposedly converted to Mormonism at this time, as did a significant portion of his flock, and it all came at the perfect time for Joe and the early church to expand. You see, Joe was in a bit of a jam in New York. Everywhere that he went, his reputation kind of preceded him, and the locals would just chase him out of town with pitchforks or just even threats of lynching. This was especially present in the town of Colesville, New York, where the Joseph Knight Sr. family was living at the time. There were a few other people in Colesville that had converted to Mormonism, but for the most part, the Knight family made up the majority of the people there, and Joe was smart enough to ask his old pal Joseph Knight Sr. to help him with a big project that was about to commence. What project is that, you might ask? Well, the first of many mass exoduses of the Mormon Church, of course. This is a theme that seems to run throughout many cults throughout all of written history. The cult builds to a level, and the locals chase it out of wherever it's settled, and that forces it to either move or die. The same thing happened to the Mormon Church multiple times, and the first 2 months of 1831 marked the first of these many exoduses that Joe's church went through before his death a mere 13 and a half years after this. So Joe went to Colesville for one whole day to ask Joseph Knight Sr. to move him and Emma out to Mentor, Ohio, which Knight consented to. If Joe was there any longer than one day, he was probably going to get killed, so he got the fuck out as soon as he could. Joe also issued multiple commands telling the 3 church congregations that existed, that was Fayette, Palmyra, and Colesville, that they needed to move out to Ohio with Joe, or they would basically be cut off. From what we can tell, most of the believing members actually fell in line behind the burgeoning cult leader Joe and moved out soon after Joe rolled into Kirtland. Or should I say slayed into Kirtland, because it was in February of 1831. Of course, as soon as Joe got to Kirtland, Ohio, he found his target family to latch onto and dig his proboscis deep into their livelihood. He began leeching off the Whitney family as soon as he arrived. The Whitney family were somewhat wealthy store owners in Kirtland, and Joe, along with the pregnant Emma, would live in the apartment above the Whitney store for the next 3 years until the congregation built them a house. The Whitneys were a couple that were slightly older than Joe and Emma, and Joe just couldn't help himself to their hospitality enough. He became so dependent on the Whitney family that he began calling Elizabeth Ann Whitney Mother Whitney. That was his little pet name. Thus, the parasitic relationship that Joe was building with the Whitneys was made abundantly clear with this cute little pet name, and would be further solidified through its continued use. After talking about Joe getting his suckers latched onto these suckers, we talked about a woman that was recorded in Mormon history by the name of Hubble, who was revealing false prophecies, apparently. She was shut down by Joe with 1 or 2 revelations, as was anybody that ventured to grow balls big enough to actually challenge the almighty Joe. In Kirtland, Joe also established the idea of commonwealth and, well, basically communism in a town that was really already practicing it under the reign of Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon. Joe basically said that they had the right idea, but they were calling it the wrong name, and the place where they put their commonwealth was supposed to be called the Bishop's Storehouse, instead of whatever they called it. Of course, Joe chose no other place to have his Bishop's Storehouse rectified than the Whitney and Company trading post at the center of Kirtland, where he was living. Last episode, I had said that the missionary force made their trip out to Jackson County, Missouri, and came back and arrived back in Kirtland, Ohio sometime in March of 1831. Well, I was actually wrong in that, with the exception of P-cubed Parley P. Pratt. That's what threw me off. The missionary force didn't make their way back to Kirtland. They just remained in Missouri in anticipation of what we'll talk about today. P-cubed was the only one that came back. As far as last episode goes, that finished up the main historical portion of the last historical timeline episode that we talked about. We finished out the rest of the episode by trying to parse out the interaction between God and Enoch, contained in the Pearl of Great Price, Book of Moses, Chapter 7. This was a crazy screed by God sending Enoch on the hardest acid trip of ever. And I summed up the interaction in the show notes of TLDR, God is a stupid dick, and Enoch is the best magician the world has ever seen. That was pretty much it, and all of the craziness sets us up for today's episode. I did forget to mention Edward Partridge. That was the guy that Joe parasitically used to hold him over until he penetrated the hearts of the Whitney family. Eddie Party Boy Partridge became the first bishop in the church in Ohio, thus controlling the bishop's storehouse. To start us out today, we need to discuss a pattern that is seen in the evolution of religions throughout antiquity. It's the same pattern that plagues ideas in general, but religions are the most prevalent analog to what we'll be studying today, and there are thousands we can examine throughout history to provide said analogs. So let's just dive right in. Let's take the Abrahamic religions for just a second here. You have the religion of the Hebrews that arose from the war god Raham and existed among a myriad other actively worshipped gods in the surrounding areas. Even the flood myth of Noah was arguably sourced from the Epic of Gilgamesh, down to the length of the ark and the number of animals that were aboard. So all the Abrahamic religions are actually Gilgamesh at heart. Well, likely people that were following the ancient Sumerian Gilgamesh religion had to break off at some point where a difference of ideas came along, or a divergence in geography, or any number of other small sticking points. Of course, what we're talking about right now is majorly simplified, just for the sake of storytelling. Anyway, the Jews had to break off from some other religion or god claim in order to balkanize into their own tribe, led by the mythical men Abraham all the way down to Moses. The rabbinic Jewish religion, or just ancient Hebrews that followed the Hebraic holy texts, were a successful and continually persecuted religious sect until the idea of a Jewish rabbi carpenter was circulated through 2nd century Greco-Jewish Israel and the surrounding areas, and thus came the birth of Christianity. The idea of Jesus was copied and passed through generations of people and evolved into hundreds, possibly thousands of different religious sects that were arguing, bickering, and all out warring with each other about who was right concerning small pieces of doctrine. I mean, should men be circumcised or not? Should you be baptized, and how? Are you saved by faith alone, or are works necessary for salvation? What did Jesus say on the cross before he died? Was Jesus actually God? Was Jesus the Son of God? Was Jesus some random piece of the trifecta of God pie, even though he was actually the whole pie all along? I mean, among all this religious strife and confusion came Emperor Constantine the Great and his mother, and sparing some of the finer details, they established Nazareth as a real place and created the Roman Catholic religion. Like I said earlier, there is a lot more nuance and detail that I'm leaving out for the sake of storytelling here, or, just drawing an analogy. So if you want to know a lot more about the thousands of years that I'm covering right now, this is clearly the wrong podcast to find that information, but the information is out there. At the fall of the Roman Empire, the Catholic Church was the best set of rules and governance to step into the massive void that this huge empiric collapse created, and it did just that. Through war and inquisitions and just out of sheer need, the Roman Catholic Church became a world superpower, acting as a shadow government where leadership could be bought and sold through indulgences. At some point in the 7th century, somebody was fed up enough with the Catholic Church and its doctrines, and they brought forth the Holy Quran. It was picked up by the warlord Muhammad, who claimed himself to be a prophet, albeit a misogynistic child fucker with multiple wives, kind of like Joseph Smith. There were multiple evolutions and schisms from the original Quranic text, from which were born the Hadiths, and warring factions of Muslims have been killing each other ever since. I suppose that's what happens when your original prophet is a warlord. You tend to favor war over reason. That's no different with any of the other Abrahamic religions. Of course, Muslims differ greatly on their perspective of Jesus, as opposed to Christians, calling him just a minor prophet second in command to Muhammad. And of course, all of this is a major divergence in what Jews consider Jesus, a mere heretic at worst, or an inspired rabbi at best. The evolution of some of the major world religions continues in an ever-changing dynamic. Fast forward a mere 870 years to the Protestant Reformation, under the banner of the Augustinian friar Martin Luther's 95 Theses that he supposedly nailed to the door of the Wittenberg Catholic Church, even though that story has little foundation in truth. Luther had a major disagreement with the church selling indulgences, and the church had a major disagreement with Luther regarding his addition to Romans 3:28 of faith alone being necessary for salvation. That was a problem. The Catholic Church didn't think it was faith alone. You had to do works in addition to it, whereas Martin Luther thought that it was just faith that would get you saved. Martin Luther wrote his famous catechisms, imparting his nuanced knowledge of the Bible and church doctrines to the masses. Thanks to the advent of the printing press, and he was considered a vicious heretic for his teachings. He had an understanding of Christianity that was evolved from the standard Roman Catholic version of Christianity, which was pervasive everywhere. And of course, his writings have a large influence on discussion topics in a lot of different churches even today. Fast forward another 300 years, and here we introduce Joseph Smith. We've talked extensively about the religious soup that the Book of Mormon evolved from, and we can trace its origins, much like any living organism can be traced back to its evolutionary ancestors. Joseph had his own ideas about Christianity, and he brought a lot of nuance to the table in his later years. Simply in regards to the Book of Mormon, Joseph was able to come up to a lot of nuanced conclusions about what the church should really be, or, his own doctrine of the Trinity, or about Jesus appearing in resurrected form to the Native Americans, or about salvation by faith alone, or dealing with hell, or any number of other challenging topics of Christianity that have inspired discussion, disagreement, or all-out war throughout history. Joseph evolved his own offshoot of Christianity, and even in his own lifetime, he evolved his own ideas about Jesus and God, and they continually changed. The Book of Mormon is written from a Trinitarian understanding of God, whereas everything in Mormonism after that is modalism, which eventually turned into this idea of an infinite regress of gods ruling over countless stars and planets that populate the night sky. All right, so that was a greatly accelerated perspective of the last 4,000 years of human religiosity, but the one main point that I'm trying to get at is evolution. All of these religions that we've discussed so far came from a religion that existed previous to it, and they changed through the process of evolution of a meme. Even the Sumerian Gilgamesh probably descended from some other religious oral tradition that there's no written record of, but that's something that we'll never know for sure, at least until time travel's invented. If you want to be enlightened about the Gilgamesh, listen to the Angry Liberal Atheist podcast. The guys over there read the Epic of Gilgamesh, and it's endlessly fascinating to draw the parallels between it and plenty of other religions that may have sprang up from the Gilgamesh loins. This evolution of the meme of a religion is a point that I don't think can be emphasized enough. We spent these first few minutes talking about a macro scale of religious evolution over 4,000 years, but the thing about the theory of evolution is its scalability. That's something that really plays into the correctness of it. If we think back to the interview that I had with Rachel Nannon Brown, she was able to draw the distinction between micro and macro evolution, but it's still the same idea, just viewed on a scale of single generations as opposed to millions of years, respectively. No matter what scale you look at, the theory of evolution holds on a macro and a micro scale. The only difference is the amount of time within the scope of research. So let's see if the theory for macroevolution of the religion meme holds on a micro scale. We've seen this evolution of religion over the course of thousands of years of recorded history, but for the theory to hold, we need to see it manifest on a smaller scale. Last episode, we talked about a woman named Hubble, and we briefly mentioned her in the wrap-up of this episode. Within a few hours of research, I was unable to find any of her writings, or even her first name, but we can be sure that she was considered a heretic by Joseph Smith for producing divine revelation that was contrary to what Joe was teaching at the time. As far as we can tell, she was cast out as a heretic, but let's just take a step back for a minute here. I would make the argument that Joe brought about the new meme on the block. We know that was the case because he was unique enough to call himself a prophet, but let's dive into it further and see what we can unearth. The way any given population functions is growth and expansion. Homo sapien has been growing and expanding for a couple 100,000 years at the very most, and hominids have been around for about 7 million years beyond that. Once a population gets to a certain point, something in that population has to change in order to adapt and expand. Our ancestors were tree dwellers for millions of years prior to bipedal mobility. As they moved to the Sahara of the African plains, they needed to become more upright and bipedal in order to move to more distant areas and obtain more resources for further growth. Take, for example, that thing where you fall asleep and then you jerk awake. Most people have done this at some point, but it's the thing where you're about to fall asleep and you're dreaming about like walking on a ledge, or you're flying, or you might just be walking on the street, and then you feel like you lose your sense of balance and you fall, making your body jerk awake with a vivid memory of what just happened in the dream. Well, that's called a hypnic jerk. It's a vestigial feature from our tree-dwelling ancestors. When our ancestors were sleeping on tree branches and they began to fall during their slumber, selection tended to favor the apes that could wake up and quickly react and grab onto a tree branch, as opposed to those who continued to sleep and just fell out of the tree and became hurt or simply died by something that was trying to eat them that was on the ground below that tree they were sleeping in. Well, when a person's sense of equilibrium undergoes a chemical change during sleep, the neurochemical differences that happen activate this hypnagogic reaction and cause the person to suddenly wake up, oftentimes with a startled jerk. Personally, I remember this happening to me once, and to this day it sticks firmly in my mind. I was riding in the shell-covered back of a pickup truck headed into southern Utah on a camping trip. It was hot back there in the bed of the pickup, but I was lying down on the carpeted floor and had my head resting in a beanbag chair. The steady motion of the truck climbing up the dirt road, coupled with the heat, kind of lulled me into this sleepy trance, with my mind still very, very awake and alert about what was going on. I had this dream where I was running around a swimming pool. I remember seeing the marble underneath my feet as I made lap after lap of this swimming pool, trying to catch the person that I was chasing. And just as I was within arm's reach, I stepped on a wet patch on the slick marble floor and I fell. I jumped awake just as my head was about to smash against the ground, and my sister and friends looked at me with surprise on their faces. My guess was that they probably watched a fairly violent jump from somebody that was dead asleep, and they were about to make fun of me for it. So all I could think to say through drowsy closed eyes was, "What? I slipped and fell, leave me alone," which just unleashed a torrent of laughter from everybody in the truck. It was a very dramatic physical reaction, and I had no conscious control over it, but I still remember it to this day, 15 years later. I had experienced the same feeling that my quadrupedal ancestors felt millions of years ago when they were about to fall out of a tree to their death during sleep. The apes that were my ancestors merely evolved the ability to suddenly wake up when that falling sensation started to happen, and they saved themselves from falling to a painful death. The reason that I relay that story is to draw the connection of macroevolutionary trait, something that's evolved over millions of years, as opposed to something like eye color, hair color, or skin tone, or, little small mutations that happen on a micro scale of evolution over 2 or 3 generations. Alright, so why did I digress so much there? I'm trying to draw the connection between macroevolution and microevolution in memes and genes in any given society. Macro happens on a large scale, hundreds of thousands or millions of years, whereas microevolutionary mutations happen from one generation to the next. This change over time happens with genes, so let's examine this drifting effect on memes, or the behaviors of society in general. We've briefly discussed how religions evolve on a considerably macro scale throughout 4,000 years of recorded human history. Of course, we looked at a very, very simplified version of this evolution, but it still serves the purpose of our examination today. So let's talk about Joe and his own evolved version of Protestant Christianity that was descended from Abrahamic traditions, which possibly has its roots in the ancient Sumerian Gilgamesh religion. There really isn't one time that we can point to where Mormonism began. We can look at the date of the first congregation, April 6, 1830, but the ideas of Joe's Church of Christ had been bouncing around inside Joe's skull for years leading up to that. He claimed as early as 1823 that he had been visited by an angel that would instruct him on attaining the legendary gold plates, which were an ancient record of the inhabitants of the American continent. I would argue that it was during this time that Joe was slowly formulating his own thoughts and ideas about what his church would be like, even if he hadn't had the official plan of starting a church this early on. In previous episodes, I've provided the scenario of Joe attending religious revivals throughout the burned-over district, and he must have watched the collection basket fill up with money at the end of each revival and just been green with envy of the person that all of that money was going to. He was probably smart enough to pick up on the triggers that people liked hearing the most or caught the most attention or applause. Remember, at this time, the Catholic Church didn't have a foothold in American culture the way it had in Europe. Christianity was spreading to a whole new part of the world. adapting and changing and slowly morphing as it was gaining new resources, consuming new souls, and adapting to new ideas and people. As Mormonism was growing in 1831, the Mormonites were becoming more populous and common in multiple areas. The church had to develop and change, or possibly be lost to the obscure annals of the 19th century history, like the Millerites or the Campbellites or dozens of other religions that spawned out of the burned over district. Some of the doctrines changed dramatically, fundamentally shifting from one polar claim to the other. Some of the doctrines, however, were merely modified to suit a given situation. One of these polar opposite distinctions that drove a very large wedge between Joe and Ollie Cowdung Oliver Cowdery was the church's stance on priestcraft. We've covered this before, but as a refresher, priestcraft is basically the idea of paying clergy for their church duties. When the Book of Mormon was being written, Ollie and Joe were a united front on this issue because it probably drew a lot of applause or appreciation by the crowds at the religious revivals that Ollie and Joe were attending. Nobody liked the idea of having a rich church or clergy members because a lot of those people had recently escaped the clutches of the great and abominable church in Europe. Once the Mormon Church was actually organized and Joe's direct revelations began to supersede the religious tenets in the Book of Mormon, Ollie and probably many other members of the church began to have a bit of a problem with Joe. This was one of the first doctrinal changes that caused a lot of people to question if Joe was indeed the one true prophet of God, or if God merely used him as a tool to bring forth the Book of Mormon. And maybe the church should be led by Ollie, or somebody more prophet-like than Joe, preferably somebody that didn't come up with contradicting revelations mere months after the Book of Mormon was published like Joe did. So Joe began to feel the pressures of running a church, and he started to understand how expensive it can get. So he did something about it. He came up with a string of revelations that made priestcraft totally okay, bro. I promise, no problem there. In fact, he provided direct revelations that he and Emma would be supported by the church and that Joe, quote, would have no strength for physical labor, end quote. One of Joe's first revelations when he rolled into Kirtland in February of 1831 was for the saints to build him and Emma a house to live in, and that all the possessions in the Whitney General Store would be absorbed by the church and be called the Bishop's Storehouse. Now, the Bishop's Storehouse was basically the idea of theocratic communism, one might say fascism, where all the possessions of the commune are gathered and those resources are divvied out to the people living inside the commune the way that the leadership sees fit. So if you weren't following the church exactly the way that Joe intended or dictated, you'd be cut off from supplies until you either fell into compliance or you just left the commune. The church still practices the doctrine of the Bishop's Storehouse even today. They just don't really take supplies from their members in order to supply the storehouse. It's just done through tithing. They use their hundreds of thousands of acres of farmland to supply the Bishop's Storehouse with actual commodities, as opposed to just filling it with money, which they do plenty of that in and of itself. Well, Joe had to use divine revelation to solve any problems or quabbles that did happen in the church, and he wasn't really shy about it. In March of 1831, he revealed what's contained in the Book of Commandments, chapter 48. There's a lot of useless preaching that's so boring and repetitive throughout the Book of Commandments, but there are a few operative verses in the chapter. And one of those verses is verse 59, but we'll read a couple of verses before and after to get a proper understanding of what the operative phrases are here. This is the Book of Commandments 48, 56 through 61. Quote, "For verily I say unto you, that great things await you. Ye hear of wars in foreign lands, but behold, I say unto you, they are nigh, even unto your doors. And not many years hence ye shall hear of wars in your own lands. Wherefore I, the Lord, have said, gather ye out from the eastern lands. Assemble ye yourselves together, ye elders of my church. Go ye forth into the western countries, call upon the inhabitants to repent, and inasmuch as they do repent, build up churches unto me, and with one heart and with one mind gather up your riches, that ye may purchase an inheritance which shall hereafter be appointed unto you. And it shall be called the New Jerusalem, a land of peace, a city of refuge, a place of safety for the saints of the Most High God. And the glory of the Lord shall be there, and the terror of the Lord also shall be there, insomuch that the wicked will not come unto it. And it shall be called Zion. End quote. All right, so the verse we needed to primarily focus on there was verse 59, when the revelation told the saints to gather up their riches to purchase an inheritance, basically to build churches in the Western countries, only after calling the Native Americans to repentance. That's the people that are in the West. This was the next stab that Joe took at trying to proselyte to the natives. Now that the first missionary force had kind of failed to fully accomplish its given task of bringing all of the Native Americans to the Mormon Church. Remember back to last historical episode, we had Ollie, P. Cubed, Dick, Zyba, Peterson, Peter Whitmer, and Freddy Willey all attempting to spread the good word to the Native American settlements that were just west of Independence, Missouri. They tried, but were kicked out by some of the natives they were trying to call to repentance in the first place. After this first failed attempt, Ollie wrote a letter to General William Clark, who was head of the U.S. Indian Affairs in 1830. Of course, Richard Cummins, who was called an anti-Mormon, wrote a letter to Clark at the same time, discouraging him from allowing these crazy Mormons to proselyte to the natives, which was probably well advised at the time. The missionary force remained in Zion, where they took up semi-permanent residence, and you have to wonder what the feelings were between Ollie and Joe at this point. What I mean is, Joe and Ollie had been locking horns a few times up to this point concerning small doctrinal issues. The biggest source of contention between them had been the whole idea of the prophet being financially sustained by the church. Ollie thought that this was in direct violation of the Book of Mormon, and he was right. And not just the Book of Mormon, but God's command in general. But Joe was a little bit more liberal on that tenet of doctrine. Joe had just commanded Ollie and friends to go on this missionary campaign and had very, very little success in doing it. He had commanded it by the way of divine revelation from God, yet the mission was almost entirely a failure if you ignore bringing Sidney Rigdon into the fold, which almost implicitly creates contradictions with the Almighty God claim, but we can ignore that when we posit the claim that Joe simply revealed it out of his own head. But still, Joe had been playing King of the Hill all by himself since he sent Ollie away. Ollie was his only friend that had the balls to actually challenge what Joe would say, and his ever-important role of devil's advocate was gone, leaving Joe completely unbridled and an unabashed theocrat in his infantile stages. Then, of course, Joe moved out to Kirtland while Ollie and friends were still out in BFE, Missouri, in an effort to expand his ever-growing church empire and bring more people and resources under his control. Within the first week that Joe arrived in Kirtland, he had absorbed the Whitney General Store and was best buddies with Hingepin Sidney Rigdon. Joe had commanded the people to give tithes and build him a house, and had latched onto a few more affluent people in town to try and parasitically leech his living off of. Emma was Joe's queen, and the Whitneys had become his unpaid servants while he ate their food and slept in their warm beds. There had been a few dissenters in the Mentor and Kirtland area that had been utterly squashed or chased off by Joe or Rigdon, but for the most part, the people listened to what Joe had to say because Rigdon trusted Joe and the people trusted Rigdon. If Joe was playing big king on the block in New York and Pennsylvania, he was playing king of the whole fucking world once he got to Ohio. Now, picture yourself in Ollie's shoes. The last time Ollie and Joe had spoken with each other was during a spat about how the church shouldn't be used to support Joe and Emma, and it was probably a very heated fight between these childhood buddies. While Ollie was on this mission that Joe sent him on, Joe had established himself as Holy Mormon Pope King Badass Motherfucker, establishing a religious commune under his almighty power of revelation from the almighty God of the universe. Now, what would you think if you were Ollie? How would you feel after having these fights over and over with Joe, and then come to find out that Joe went so far the other direction, which came into strong opposition to your sincerely held religious beliefs? Once again, I kind of feel bad for Ollie when I step into his shoes. Joe just keeps fucking him over and over, and he didn't care. I mean, Joe was just unapologetic about how much of an unappreciative fucking he was giving Ollie, and I would wager to say that having Rigdon on Joe's side made him even more secured in his manufactured false position of power. Now consider all of these electric emotions that must have been arcing between Joe and Ollie, and then include in your consideration the revelation we just read that was given in March of 1831, while Ollie and team were in Missouri. Joe basically used all of the hard work they had been doing in service to the Church of Christ and employed it as a springboard to just ask for more money and volunteers to go proselyte to the Lamanites, call them to repentance, and establish Zion, the New Jerusalem, on the borders of the Lamanites. We have no record of a single thank you from Joe to Ollie, but personally, I would doubt that we would even expect to find one, given the disagreements that were plaguing their friendship. Well, Joe used this interim time from March to June to collect money and goods for the church and appoint a new historian and scribe. You see, from the time that Joe and Ollie had teamed up, Joe had been the main guy and Ollie had been his primary scribe. That was the power dynamic that Joe had loosely established very early on, and anytime Ollie tried to circumvent that dynamic and elevate himself to a level equal with Joe, the insurrection was always quelled by new revelations. Take, for example, the Book of Commandments, chapter 50. It's a perfect example of Joe making Ollie's role less and less significant in the church in an effort to slowly squeeze him out of any powerful role in the church and establish Joe as the one true prophet of God. Quote, "Behold, it is expedient in me that my servant John should write and keep a regular history, and assist you, my servant Joseph, in transcribing all things which shall be given unto you. And again I say unto you, that it shall be appointed unto him to keep the church record and history continually. For Oliver I have appointed to another office." End quote. So that revelation appointed our buddy John Whitmer as the new scribe and historian of the church, removing a huge responsibility from Ollie's shoulders. You might think, at least Ollie had some other commitment or office to take care of in the church. Well, I can't for the life of me figure out what that was, aside from being a missionary. Before this, Ollie was responsible for being Joe's right-hand man, documenting every single crazy fucking thing that fell out of Joe's fucked up religious zealot crazed skull, and Joe took that responsibility away from Ollie. In November, Ollie is given a task, but we'll get to the details of that in another show. We still need to cover what happened leading up to November. In May of 1831, Joe gave this revelation contained in the Book of Commandments, chapter 53. It was obviously a reaction to somebody preaching false doctrine, and it's not very thinly veiled. This is chapter 53, verses 1 through 6. Quote, "Hearken, O ye elders of my church, and give ear to the voice of the living God. and attend to the words of wisdom, which shall be given unto you, according as ye have asked, and are agreed as touching the church, and the spirits which have gone abroad in the church. Behold, verily I say unto you, that there are many spirits which are false spirits, which have gone forth in the earth, deceiving the world. And also Satan hath sought to deceive you, that he might overthrow you. Behold, I, the Lord, have looked upon you, and have seen abominations in the church, which profess my name. But blessed are they who are faithful, and endure, whether in life or in death, for they shall inherit eternal life. But woe unto them that are deceivers and hypocrites, for thus saith the Lord, I will bring them to judgment. End quote. At some point, I know this is kind of redundant, but at some point I'm going to stop pointing all of these little insurrections out, because so much of the Book of Commandments is just chastising anybody that preaches false doctrines or claims the power of prophecy in some way, or might be calling them to repentance or whatever. This has happened so many times, and we have only covered a very small fraction of all of the verses in the Book of Commandments that are similar to this. Remember Hubble, the woman that falsely claimed the power of revelation? Remember Hiram Page from a year before this? He revealed the location of Zion, apparently, and Joe came up with a revelation that said Hiram Page was led by Satan and was preaching a false doctrine. I mean, there have been multiple examples of this happening. And like I said, we've only covered a small fraction of them all. And there's probably only a small fraction of these recorded in the history or the Book of Commandments in comparison to how many of these small schisms were actually happening. There were probably people contradicting Joe all the time that we will never know about from any legitimate church or secular source. There are probably accounts of Joe being a tyrannical asshole in personal journals and newspaper publications, but I really haven't found a whole lot to get a realistic idea of how much of an anthropomorphic iron fist Joe was, outside of official church publications anyway. That being said, we'll probably stop covering all of these schisms in so much detail unless they're really important, but I do want to pause and draw a circle around this for a minute. We started out this episode discussing how religions grow and change over time and geography. It seems like a church grows and expands to a point where it can no longer function as a single entity. And then there's a breakoff or a schism that forces the original church to either change or excise the dissenters. Well, Joe's church was doing the same thing. It was growing and expanding and including more and more people with more diverse ideas and perspectives of what Christianity is supposed to be. When somebody that was part of the church would have a disagreement with some point of doctrine or a new revelation that Joe gave, Joe would react in a way that would create an us, forcing the person that disagreed to be part of the them. These people would either ignore the cognitive dissonance and continue following Joe, or they would continue to fight and be pushed away with the label of apostate or infidel or just led astray by Satan. These schisms happened countless times in Joe's church on a macro and a micro level. Some of these forced people like Dr. Philastus Hurlbut to go do a bunch of research and help publish a book labeled as anti-Mormon. Of course, I'm referring to Mormonism Unveiled 1834 there. And some of these schisms forced prominent leaders to break away and start their own religion. Some caused people to be excommunicated, or like in Ollie's case, leave and then come back after Joe had died in the Carthage Shootout. Take, for example, a man named Wycombe Clark. In spring of 1831, him along with Northrop Sweet and 4 others apostatized. Wycombe called himself the one true revelator and prophet of God, and the 6 men began the Pure Church of Christ. That's what it was called, the Pure Church of Christ. This constitutes the first official offshoot church that descended directly from Joseph Smith's Latter-day Saint movement, and it was all due to a small disagreement between Joe and the 6 people that organized this new church. From what we can tell, the Pure Church of Christ had a few meetings, but then they soon disbanded and really weren't heard from again. This offshoot church's status today is wholly defunct and has no presence anywhere except in history books. This example just highlights the ebb and flow of a church with any given doctrine. It's happened for thousands of years with every major religion on a large and small scale, and it happened with Mormonism in its early days, even up to today. If you follow Mormon headlines, you'll know that there was recently a massive exodus of church members that was held just outside of Temple Square. Over 1,500 people that have their records on the church logbooks gathered in Salt Lake City and sent in their resignation letters, all in response to the church's stance on the family structure of gays. Personally, I say good. But I'm also a little bit conflicted about this. Since these people split, there's been a huge influx of new members into churches that have split off of the main Salt Lake City Mormonism, but still hold some parts of the church as true. If you don't know what I'm referring to, do a Google search for Church is True, all one word, or New Mormonism, or Mormonism 2.0, or Church Caffeinated. I mean, there have been dozens of breakoffs that have absorbed some of these people that are coming out of the one true church, which is the Salt Lake City Mormonism. One might say that these people probably can't live without a church-like structure to underpin their entire lives, so it's understandable and acceptable that they left the Salt Lake City Mormonism only to join a break-off faction that resulted from a schism in church doctrine, or maybe even started their own. But I just can't get on board with that assertion. How far can the sweater unravel and still protect you from the buffetings of the real world before it's serving as nothing but a useless label? I mean, I call myself a cultural Mormon, much like a person that grew up Jewish calls themselves a cultural Jew, but nothing about the church informs my perspective of reality or sexuality or sinning anymore. Nor do I feel like any part of the church protects me from the buffetings of the world. If the entire facade falls and its foundation is built on a mountain of steaming bullshit, it's a cancerous entity that needs to be done away with as a whole. We shouldn't be just keeping some of it and getting rid of other parts of it. Let's just swear off the Mormon religion and leave it to rot in the annals of history. We can do that as a society. Now, I understand that the church is great for family structure and keeping people away from alcohol and promiscuity, but at what cost? How much psychological damage can we allow before the net positive that the church provides is overshadowed by the overwhelming problems of depression, anxiety, self-loathing, sexual frustration or confusion, fracturing of families, disconnection from reality, and overpowering us versus them mentality? How long does the church get a free ride of fucking people's minds before we finally say enough and call it to repentance for the damage that it's done to society? We can't just say, I don't like what the church says about blacks or gays or alcohols or tattoos, so I'm going to run to a different church that still believes in the Book of Mormon, but isn't allowed to tax me 10% of my income to fund multi-billion-dollar shopping malls, media conglomerations, or insurance agencies. We can't just pick and choose what we do and don't like about the church and still call ourselves members of that church, because by the church's standards, we are no longer true believers and we're treated as such. We're just still giving them 10% of our income. Look, every possible good that any church offers can be attained through secular means. The church may have an amazing sense of community, and it may provide a lattice-type structure for a family to grow up using for support, but all of the negatives associated with the church constitutes a net negative on society in general. And the Mormon Church is not alone in this, don't get me wrong. I can talk about any church being part of this same problem. No doubt, there are a lot of benefits to having a group of like-minded individuals to spend time with or lean on when times get hard. I get that. A lot of studies have been conducted looking at the mental and social benefits of being part of a group where you're accepted for who you are, and lo and behold, the people that are part of a society tended to be better off or happier in some way or have slightly better quality of life. We are a social species, so it's understandable that we are better off when we're involved in a social group. There are a lot of people who join churches and their life completely turns around for the better. Some people that I speak with on a very regular basis credit the church with saving their life. And they say that there's no possible way that the church could have done that unless it were true. But I would make the argument that the effect the church has on any given individual has absolutely nothing to do with how true or false the church is. I heard this example on a diatribe of episode 140 of the Scathing Atheist, and I would recommend checking it out because the host does a fantastic job of constructing an analogy that deals with the social benefits of a religion and how that has nothing to do with how true or false the religion is. To be honest, one of my favorite podcasts is the Scathing Atheist. And one of the main reasons for that is the diatribe that the host does at the beginning of each episode. No Illusions does just such an amazing job of deconstructing or offering a unique perspective on some large topic inside atheism or humanism. His diatribe at the beginning of episode 140 is one of my favorite diatribes ever, and it plays perfectly into what I've been alluding to for the last few minutes. Noah makes his point way better than I can, so I'm just going to let him speak for himself. This clip is used with Noah's explicit permission, and I'll admit, I've listened to it almost a dozen times, and I pull something new from it each time I hear it. Feel free to rewind and listen to it a few times like I did to get as much out of the screed as it has to offer. Sometimes I need the repetition to get all the words because they're spoken so damn fast, but it's done simply perfectly. And I think the diatribes are a huge asset to the atheist and humanist community.
The you're too mean stuff that I'm talking about here is more like from the philosophical angle. It's not that people are saying we're assholes. They're saying that we're intellectually dishonest assholes. You know, they're saying, hey, you'd be a more effective communicator if you were at least willing to admit to some of the positive qualities of religion. In fact, if you listen to the most recent episode of our new show, God Awful Movies, you heard a form of this argument. And sorry for the shameless cross-promotion, but if you haven't heard it, you really should. I think it might be our best episode to date. And a big reason for that was the hilarious guest that Eli invited on, a comedian by the name of Micah Sherman, who absolutely killed it. So at one point, he's trying to make the larger point about how, like, religious kids do some really creepy shit. But on his way to get to this point, he threw religion a bone that I took issue with on the air. He said something along the lines of, like, you know, I know that religion has positive effects on some people. I think it was something like, you know, I have born-again friends who really turn their lives around because of their faith, but. Now, that's something I hear from a lot of atheists, to be honest. You know, the propitiative throwaway line about how religion is just fine for some people. Conciliatory admissions about how, you know, religion helped my cousin Dave get off of heroin, don't get me wrong, but, you know, so many atheists like to toss those out beforehand so as to not kick religion in the nuts too hard. You know, it's like the minimalist approach to the compliment sandwich. Makes you sound more reasonable, I guess, if you can show that you're not writing off all of religion, you're just pointing out some flaws. Now, I would imagine that a lot of atheists toss this shit out in conversation, even if they don't believe it. You know, like, one of the things that makes admitting to one's atheism publicly so awkward is that there's no way of doing it without telling people around you that they're wrong. You know, so if you're trying to appease them with a soft-hearted endorsement, you know, that's probably a good way to soften the blow, I guess. You know, don't get me wrong, I'm sure religion is fine for you or whatever. And if that's all it is, if it's just a rhetorical way to get your foot in the door to make a larger point, I guess I can, like, more or less overlook it. But the problem arises when people think that it's actually true. So, you know, let's examine that precept for a second. Let's look at Cousin Dave. Now, inarguably, Cousin Dave was a fuck-up in every aspect. He was a hopeless heroin addict, whatever. And then Dave got saved, and he turned his life around, and since then he's been working a steady job. He's off the needle. You know, it's been years. Okay, now if you're a critical thinker, and I think you are, you've already noticed the problem here. We're dealing with a sample size of 1, right? So if we want to examine the success rate of religion in getting fucked up people to turn their lives around, we'd need a large sample size of fuck-ups that got saved. And then we'd need to compare religion's success rate to the success rates of secular counseling and methadone treatments and family interventions, etc. Before we can make a claim as bold as religion turned Dave's life around, we would need to see these data. I mean, sure, whatever. Dave credits Jesus for turning his life around, but I've seen chemo patients credit Jesus for the remission of their cancer. Right? I mean, if Dave took some homeopathic stop doing heroin pills right before the turnaround, you'd demand to see that kind of information before you were willing to endorse homeopathy, so why should religion be any different? Now, obviously, nobody's actually tracking these data, but I'm willing to wager your choice of my testicles that secular programs outperform religious ones when it comes to helping addicts. You know, I don't think I'm creeping too far out of the ledge when I say that the evidence-based thing that adjusts itself based on success and failure is going to generally outdo the mythology-based one that has the same answer for every fucking problem. But let's say I'm wrong, right? Let's say that the AA has some other reason for, refusing to release any information about recidivism and success rates. Let's say that somebody, does all this research and they bring it back to me and they say, hey, no, look, finding Jesus has a significantly higher success rate for heroin addicts than methadone. Even in light of those data, I wouldn't concede the point. And here's why. Religion is bullshit. It's not true, right? So, if I could stop you from doing heroin by convincing you that, if you did, you'd be attacked by gremlins, would I be doing you a favor? If instead of living your life plagued by addiction, you were living your life terrified of gremlins, is that a net positive? And by the way, are all lies okay if they offer a net positive? Try wandering down that ethical road for a while and see how long it takes you to reject it. Now, some people will dismiss my gremlins analogy as too harsh, but if anything, the problem is that it's not harsh enough. To make it accurate, we have to also assume that there are multiple worldwide institutions that are trying to exploit the fear of gremlins to take your fucking money. We'd have to pretend that politicians all over the country are winning votes by promising to eradicate the gremlins. We'd have to assume that violent extremists are using fear of gremlins to recruit their suicide soldiers. Because look, religion doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's no way to give Cousin Dave the addiction recovery portion of religion without also giving him the get and take it advantage by money grubbing pastors bit, or the learning to hate gay people part, or the reinforcing cultural misogyny part, or the us and them part, or the vote for me because I love Jesus more part. It's a package deal. And even if you could identify one part of the package that's good, it doesn't counterbalance the mountains of damaging bullshit on the other side of the scale. Now, I would argue, and in fact have argued, and in fact am arguing right now, that there is no good part. I've yet to see a single aspect of religion that couldn't be improved upon if the faith element was removed. I do agree that joining new communities is helpful for drug addicts, but I think a new community that doesn't demand fealty to a magical immortal carpenter is at the very least equally effective. It's not that I'm too stubborn to admit that religion has benefits for some people. Fuck, having diphtheria has some benefits. Probably helps you lose weight or something. But that doesn't put me under any prerogative to start my conversation about it by saying, hey, don't get me wrong, diphtheria is right for some people. The problem is that I'm making no effort to carve out excuses for the religious people around me. So if you want to call me an asshole, that's fine. I call myself an asshole. But I'm only an asshole because social convention would have me be a liar. And I'd rather be an asshole.
Thank you, Noah, for allowing me to use that clip and for making the larger point so succinctly. Also, thank you very much for having me on to talk about the Meadows Massacre and the Carthage Jail Shootout. If you haven't heard those episodes of the Scathing Atheist, I'll leave links to them in the show notes. They were really a lot of fun, and Noah does a great job conducting interviews. If you haven't already, you should really check out the shows that are put out by the Scathing Atheist crew. They have Skepticrat, which is their political show, the Scathing Atheist, which is their atheist headlines show, and of course, God Awful Movies, their insane religious movie review show, which is making quite the splash lately, and it has me cracking up every Tuesday. Anyway, back to the larger point. Noah said it so well. If we examine the positives that religion has to offer, they are overshadowed by all the negatives that go along with it. It's a package deal. The Mormon religion offers a very strong community and family-centered structure to raise children in, and those positives can't be ignored. But all the other shit that the church also includes in their teachings poison the well. We can see the benefits of a social species being part of a society, but joining the Mormon Church also has all the extra baggage of the Book of Mormon and the history of the church and inciting mental illness at multiple levels and in multiple different ways. The secular analog that doesn't have all this extra bullshit to overcome is definitionally better. The negatives of the church so outweigh any positives that it offers that the overall negative renders the whole Mormon religion as nothing but a parasite on society. Add in the multi-level marketing, the ironclad tithing structure, and you're looking at a well-organized, well-managed, multi-billion-dollar pyramid scheme founded on modern-day slave labor. How can a person possibly make the argument that the Mormon Church is a good thing in light of all of these facts? How can people say, well, the Salt Lake City Mormonism is wrong, but the church is right and the Book of Mormon is true, so we just follow it anyway? That makes you compliant with all of the damage that the church has done and currently does to its members and society in general. Anybody that supports the Catholic Church with attendance or tithes is at some level responsible for the worldwide child rape syndicate that is headquartered in its own nation state, making it above any national or international laws. Every single Catholic that supports a criminal organization with billions of dollars in assets that shuffles child molesting priests around is culpable at some level for allowing that to happen and giving money and attendance to that organization. The same culpability applies to anybody that's a member of the Mormon Church at any level. Even if they say we aren't a member of the Mormon Church, we just believe the Book of Mormon to be true and we're just cultural Mormons, so we keep going to church, at some level, those people have dirty blood money on their folded hands, and they refuse to see the bigger problem, which is the church itself. All of this to say, we don't need the church to be good people. We've watched the Mormon religion change and adapt to new social pressures. We've seen people break off from the mainstream Mormon religion and start their own religion, sticking with some of the teachings and ignoring others. I'm arguing that we, as a species, have evolved past the need for superstition. We don't need the church anymore. We need a community to grow and develop in. Don't get me wrong on that. But like Noah said in his diatribe, the secular analog to these church communities can't help but be better, because it doesn't come in the package deal with all the superstition and other baggage that the Mormon Church or any other church has to deal with. And that's the larger point I'm getting at. The people that were members of the church that had some kind of disagreement with Joe either dealt with the problems and suppressed their own sense of cognitive dissonance, or they just completely broke off and joined up with some other religious sect, or went completely AWOL and were excommunicated and ended up starting their own church. With everything that was happening between Joe and Ollie during 1831, it's really hard to try and understand why Ollie didn't just do that. Ollie was arguably more of a preacher than Joe was. He probably didn't have the imagination that Joe did, but he could sure rile up a crowd and preach like a badass, and he knew how to sell the Mormon product. Why didn't he just break off and start up his own church based on the Book of Mormon? The world may never know. The next 7 months, from late May to December 1831, involved some of the most horrible backstabbings delivered to Ollie, all orchestrated by Joe. The worst part is, Ollie just takes it, from what we can tell. First off, Joe apparently wasn't satisfied by the mission trip out to Independence, so he makes a trip for himself. Sometimes when you want something done right, you just have to do it yourself. And Joe finally got off of his lazy fucking duffer and made the 800-mile, or for our non-empirical friends, 1,300-kilometer journey out to the very western edge of the European settlements in America. In June of 1831, Joe gave this revelation contained in the Book of Commandments, chapter 54. Quote, Behold, thus saith the Lord unto the elders whom he hath called and chosen in these last days by the voice of his Spirit, saying, I, the Lord, will make known unto you what I will that ye should do from this time until the next conference, which shall be held in Missouri, upon the land which I consecrate unto my people, which are a remnant of Jacob, and them who are heirs according to the covenant. Wherefore, verily, I say unto you, let my servants Joseph and Sidney take their journey as soon as preparations can be made to leave their homes and journey to the land of Missouri. End quote. Joe had been forced into not fucking around mode, the reason of which we'll close out this episode talking about. And Joe was ready to expand the church to include Zion, the New Jerusalem. So, Joe and Hinchpin Rigdon set out for independence themselves to see what was there and why Ollie and company had failed so miserably in their mission. But before they could leave, later on in that same chapter of the Book of Commandments, Joe established the entire missionary force in the early church. Things are undergoing big changes here, and up to this point there had been few proselyting missions to very few places, but no substantial push had been made to really bring in the new converts. So let's just talk about this. I could read this part out of the Book of Commandments, but it doesn't have everybody's last names, which helps out a lot. So I'll read this out of the Doctrine and Covenants section 52, just for ease of reading. Quote, And again, verily I say unto you, let my servant Lyman White and my servant John Coral take their journey speedily. And also my servant John Murdoch and my servant Hiram Smith take their journeys into the same place by the way of Detroit. And let them journey from thence preaching the word by the way, saying none other than that which the prophets and apostles have written, and that which is taught them by the Comforter through the prayer and faith. Continuing on in verse 22. And again, verily I say unto you, let my servant Thomas B. Marsh and my servant Ezra Thayer take their journey also, preaching the word by the way unto this same land. And again, let my servant Isaac Morley and my servant Ezra Booth take their journey, also preaching the word by the way unto this same land. And again, let my servants Edward Party Boy Partridge and Not So Smarty Marty Harris take their journey with my servants Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith Jr. Let my servants P-Cubed Parley P. Pratt and Orson Brainpower Pratt take their journey and preach by the way even unto this same land. And let my servants Solomon Hancock and Simeon Carter also take their journeys unto this same land and preach by the way. End quote. And it goes on and on and on and on like that. Now, I know that was a lot of names. So now do you see why we throw the nicknames onto anybody that's important to our storyline? Now, don't you worry, dear listener. When any of those people that were listed there really distinguish themselves, we'll give them a proper name or nickname. But for now, they're just a bunch of faceless names headed out in pairs to spread the good word about the church. And the rest of that section just details some of the leadership roles and the offices of some of the other people that will run the church in the absence of Joe, Rigdon, and all of these missionaries. But we'll just wait until David Michael and I get there on the My Book of Mormon podcast to really discuss them in detail. All we need to ascertain from that section in the Book of Commandments and Doctrine and Covenants is that Joe sent out a huge missionary force and left Kirtland himself, along with Hinchpin Rigdon, Not So Smarty Marty, and Party Boy Partridge, head for Independence, Missouri. Before we talk about the journey out to Missouri and the relative success that everybody had, we need to talk about the Melchizedek priesthood. Until this point, it has never been mentioned in the official history of the church. The Melchizedek priesthood made a brief appearance in the Doctrine and Covenants, but that was only added later on. The same passage that mentions the Melchizedek priesthood in the Doctrine and Covenants is basically absent from the original Book of Commandments that was published 2 years before the first copy of the Doctrine and Covenants was published. So the term Melchizedek priesthood is anachronistic in this respect. Here, on June 3rd of 1831, 2 years after the church claims that the Melchizedek priesthood existed, the first mention of it makes its way into the Official History of the Church, Volume 1, page 175 and 176. Now, this is kind of fun, because the publication of the history of the church that I'm reading from was printed in 1980 and was last edited in 1951 by George Albert Smith. What's fun about this version specifically is the footnotes. As far as I'm aware, the actual 7-volume history of the church is fairly unchanged by later edits. You know, it's kind of funny how the Book of Mormon or the Doctrine and Covenants can be changed and edited all over the place, but the actual history of the church that was dictated by Joe in 1838 isn't really subject to these same edits. Anyway, what we do find is footnotes with the Mormon apologetics for what's contained in the history of the church volumes. When I was reading about Joe and Ollie getting the priesthood in May of 1829, I remember finding it odd that they were given the holy priesthood of Aaron, but there's absolutely no mention of the Melchizedek priesthood, which is the step above the Aaronic priesthood. The Melchizedek priesthood is supposedly necessary for running the church and for confirming people as members of the church, but Joe didn't really mention it until a year into the church's operations, and 2 years after it supposedly existed, and this June 1831 conference is when it first shows up. The Mormon apologetic in the footnote is fantastic in its efforts to justify this discrepancy, so I'm going to read the passage out of the History of the Church, Volume 1, page 175 through 176, and then we'll cover the apologetics that are attached to it in the footnotes. For any Never Mormons out there, this may seem very trivial and ridiculous to spend any amount of time on, but to my fellow Exmos, you know how much of a problem this creates. Joe operated the church for an entire year without having the Melchizedek priesthood. It didn't even exist. This is absolutely insane in my mind, and hopefully my fellow Exmos share my same surprise about the situation. This is taken from the History of the Church, 175 through 176. Quote, "On the 3rd of June, the elders from the various parts of the country where they were laboring came in, and the conference before appointed convened in Kirtland, and the Lord displayed his power to the most perfect satisfaction of the saints. The man of sin was revealed, and the authority of the Melchizedek priesthood was manifested and conferred for the first time upon several of the elders." End quote. That was the first appearance of the Melchizedek priesthood in the entire history of the entire church. In the original Book of Commandments, it hadn't been mentioned before this. No journal entries talk about it. No letters from church leaders ever mention it. This is the first account of the Melchizedek priesthood in Joe's church. This is a glaring discrepancy that we need to address. So let's see what the apologetics has to say about it in the footnotes of the History of the Church that I'm reading from. Quote, "A misapprehension has arisen from the minds of some respecting the statement," now quoting the passage we just read, "the authority of the Melchizedek priesthood has manifested and conferred for the first time upon the several of the elders. It has been supposed that this passage meant that the higher or Melchizedek priesthood was now for the first time conferred upon men in this dispensation. This, of course, is an error, since even before the church was organized, the apostleship, the highest authority in the Melchizedek priesthood, was conferred upon Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, and very probably upon David Whitmer also. The prophet does not mean that the Melchizedek priesthood was given for the first time in the church. It was at this conference, however, that the special office of high priest was for the first time conferred upon men in this dispensation, except in so far as apostles are also high priests, and of course as there were men who had been ordained to the apostleship before this conference in June of 1831. In that manner, there had been high priests in the church, but not otherwise. End quote. All right. Let's dig in here. Let's do our favorite thing on this show and take a skeptical look at the evidence. We want to look at the pro-Mormon and the anti-Mormon side of the facts and see which perspective is most tight like unto a dish. Which of these arguments holds water? I already said that this is the first time in any Mormon publication that the Melchizedek priesthood by name is mentioned explicitly. It makes no previous appearance before this. Even when we look back at the Joseph Smith history, it talks about the Aaronic priesthood being conferred on Ollie and Joe by Peter, James, and John, but it makes no mention of the Melchizedek priesthood. Beyond that, if you read in the footnotes of the Joseph Smith history, you'll see that it speculates that the Melchizedek priesthood was given to Joe and Ollie a few weeks after the Aaronic priesthood, but there is no evidence for that exists at all. Absolutely none. That is purely a baseless assertion inserted into the footnotes of the Joseph Smith history by believing Mormon historians to make the historical reality fit their understanding of the idea of this restorationist origination of the church. Now, what do I mean by the restorationist origination of the church there? Just as a short explanation, the Mormon Church claims to be the original church established by Jesus, restored through Joseph Smith in these latter days. It's hard for a believer to wrap their mind around the idea that God didn't reveal the whole church to Joe at once, complete with temple ordinances, sacrament rituals, and most importantly, the Melchizedek priesthood. But the reality is, all of these features were introduced into the church based on necessity alone. They weren't all just dropped in at once like one would expect the Almighty God of the universe to do, but instead came along as they were needed. This all plays into the idea that Joe's claims of authority evolved as situations necessitated, which we talked about in episode 19 that was titled Priesthood Power Play. If God were using Joseph Smith to restore the original church to the earth, one would think that it could be done very simply with divine revelation all in one complete package, which I assume that's what the Book of Mormon is supposed to be, but it didn't do a very good job. Instead, we see a constant evolution and change in claims in order to satisfy specific circumstances. Let's address the Mormon apologetic here regarding the Melchizedek priesthood. In the footnote that we read from the history of the church, it claimed that the Melchizedek priesthood has been around since the foundation of the church, and anybody that was called as an apostle had this higher priesthood. Well, here we run into another problem that spawns from asserting this anachronism. Nobody in the church was called to the office of high priest yet. I believe at some point Joe called himself the high priest of the church, but nobody else had been called to this office before this point. Beyond that, and an even bigger problem, nobody had been called as an apostle yet. Up to this point, everybody that had joined the church was a member, and anybody that was given any role in a leadership position was called an elder. Even our pal, Ollie Cowdung, was just an elder, and he was one of the 3 founding fathers of the church. He was never ordained with apostle before this. So, when the footnotes of the Joseph Smith history assert that the Melchizedek priesthood existed since 1829, an assertion for which there is absolutely no evidence, and then goes on to claim in the footnotes that we just read in the history of the church that everybody that had been called an apostle up to this point had the Melchizedek priesthood, it duly nullifies the assertions. Both of them are blatantly anachronistic. In order to make the history fit their current view on the different priesthoods, the church has to posit historical occurrences that we have absolutely no evidence for, which is a huge problem from a scholar's or historian's perspective. Now, I'm not saying that I'm either one of those. In fact, to the contrary, I'm not formally schooled in either one of those academic disciplines, but I do like to look at the pro and anti-Mormon side of the history, consider the arguments from both sides, and see which one of them has the most explanatory power. So, now that we've discussed the pro-Mormon or believing Mormon side of the facts here, let's discuss the so-called anti-Mormon side of the argument and see which side takes the most leaps in logic to come to their conclusion. The anti-Mormon perspective would assert that as Joe was organizing his church, he was just flying by the seat of his pants. I've said that a couple of times before. He didn't know what he was doing, and therefore, when a situation would arise, he would come up with divine revelation to fix the problem. So whenever his claim of divine authority was challenged, he would invent an office higher than everybody else in order to supersede any questions of authority. This happened when Joe and Ollie were both elders, and Joe wanted to squeeze Ollie out of the full leadership position, so he called himself the high priest and revelator of the church. It happened during the translation of the plates when Ollie tried to translate a little bit for himself. In reaction to that, Joe said that Ollie's gift was with the rod of nature and not with translation. We referred to this earlier, but when Hiram Page revealed the location of Zion, Joe claimed utmost authority to be the one single revelator, which inherently overpowered any previous spurious revelations or any later revelations given by anybody after this time. Well, the so-called anti-Mormon side would assert that this spontaneous appearance of the Melchizedek priesthood was merely another evolution of Joe's authority claims. If that is the case, then we would expect there to be some point of insurrection that we could point to that was a social pressure that caused the Melchizedek priesthood to be evolved in reaction to. Well, in answer to that, I would assert that we had the uprising of the Pure Church of Christ by Wycombe Clark and Northrop Sweet. That could be considered one social pressure that forced the introduction of an authority claim that these two elders didn't have. Think about it. Clark and Sweet were elders with leadership roles in the church, and they broke off to start their own church, still living in Kirtland. Joe had to react to this social pressure somehow, and I personally would argue that the Melchizedek priesthood evolved out of this pressure. It doesn't have to be this one specific offshoot group either. It could have been due to any number of other people that had dissenting opinions, but this was the first official offshoot, and Joe must have done something to react to it, right? Inventing a higher authority claim such as the Melchizedek priesthood would be a very reasonable reaction to this church of infidels rising up, calling themselves the Pure Church of Christ. So, tell me, out of those two perspectives of the existing facts, which one of them makes the most sense? Which argument here is tight like unto a dish? Which really holds water? Is it the side that dubiously claims two historical anachronisms to fit within the claims of its belief system? Or is it the side that requires no dubious historical claims and falls perfectly in line with the personality of Joseph Smith up to this point? I tried my best to present both sides and give them equal time. You have to decide which one of them makes the most sense. Let's get back to the timeline here. We were talking about this new missionary force of Joe, Hinchpin Rigdon, Not So Smarty Marty, and Eddie Partyboy Partridge heading out to Missouri to meet up with the missionary force of Ollie, Dick Zyba, Peter Whitmer, and Freddy G. Willey, which was stationed in a town called Caw, Missouri. Now, that was about 12 miles west of Independence, Missouri, right on the edge of the European settlements. The new missionary group spends the next couple of weeks getting out to Missouri from Kirtland, proselyting all the way. And Joe had pretty much just hitched his wagon to this charismatic preacher, Hinchpin Rigdon, and the wagon train was caboosed by the two rich guys in the group, which were the almost used up Not So Smarty Marty, who was nearly broke by this time, and of course Bishop Eddie Partyboy Partridge, who was running off of the Partridge Family Trust Fund. Together, this mishmash of religious zealots embarked upon their journey with relative success in comparison to the previous missionary group. When they arrived in Missouri in July of 1831, this is what was recorded in History of the Church, Volume 1, page 189. Quote, "The meeting of our brethren, who had long awaited our arrival, was a glorious one, and moistened with many tears. It seemed good and pleasant for brethren to meet together in unity. But our reflections were many, coming as we had from a highly cultivated state of society in the East, and now standing upon the confines or western limits of the United States, and looking into the vast wilderness of those that sat in darkness. How natural it was to observe the degradation, leanness of intellect, ferocity, and jealousy of a people that were nearly a century behind the times, and to feel for those who roamed about without the benefit of civilization, refinement, or religion." End quote. Basically, Joe and company had moved from the modern New York and Ohio area to the shithole that was Missouri, and when they got there, they were like, wow, what a shithole. These poor people that are just wandering around in a haze of degradation and leanness of intellect. It's a good thing the missionaries were there to bring some goddamn civility to these country bumpkin monsters. So let's talk about how things had been going for the missionary troop up to this point. Ollie, Dick, Zyba, and Peterson, and Freddy Willey had been proselyting as much as possible with very minimal success. At this point, P Cubed had returned to Kirtland, only to be sent out to the eastern states with his brother Orson Brainpower Pratt on their own mission. The last historical episode, we talked about the missionary team running into problems preaching the Book of Mormon to the natives and trying but failing to apply for a permit from General Clark of the Lewis and Clark expedition to go and preach the gospel to the natives. Well, we have a letter from Ollie to Joe that was received on May 7th, 1831, and I think it illustrates the entire mood of the missionary trip. I tried pulling this letter from somewhere other than the history of the church, but it seems like it's the primary source for the letter, so I'll just read it in its entirety. There's a lot of really good stuff in here to talk about. Quote, "Our dearly beloved brethren, I have nothing particular to write as concerning the Lamanites, and because of a short journey which I have just returned from, in consequence of which I have not written to you since the 16th of the last month, I and brother Zyba Peterson went into the county east, which is Lafayette, about 40 miles, and in the name of Jesus called on the people to repent, many of whom are, I believe, earnestly searching for truth, and if sincerely I pray, they may find that precious treasure, for it seems to be wholly fallen in the streets, that equity cannot enter in the letter we received from you. We were informed that the opposition was great against you. Now, our beloved brethren, we verily believe that you can also rejoice that we are counted worthy to suffer shame for his name. For almost the whole country, which consists of Universalists, Atheists, Deists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, and professed Christians, priests, and people with all the devils from the infernal pit, are united and foaming out their own shame. God forbid that I should bring a railing accusation against them, for vengeance belongeth unto him who is able to repay, and herein, brethren, we confide. I am informed of another tribe of Lamanites lately who have an abundance of flocks of the best kind of sheep and cattle, and manufacture blankets of superior quality. The tribe is very numerous. They live 300 miles west of Santa Fe and are called Navajos. Why I mention this tribe is because I feel under obligation to communicate to you all my labors and travels, believing as I do that much is expected from me in the cause of our Lord, and not doubting, but I daily am remembered before the throne of the Most High by all of my brethren, as well as those who have not seen my face in the flesh, as those who have. We begin to expect our brother Parley P. Pratt. We have heard from him only when he was at St. Louis. We are all well, and preach the gospel we will if earth and hell oppose our way, and we will dwell in the midst of scorpions, for in Jesus we trust. Grace be with you all. Amen. P.S. I beseech Brother Newell K. Whitney to remember and write and direct to me Independence, Jackson County, Missouri. End quote. The main point that I'm referring to in that letter that we need to discuss is the wealthy Native American tribe that Ollie was referred to. They were indeed the Navajos from what we can tell, and they were indeed fairly wealthy in comparison to a lot of other tribes. It's interesting that is the target of this proselyting campaign is the richest of all of the Native American tribes. But that letter in and of itself isn't the interesting thing we really need to discuss here. We have Ollie's account of his speech to the Delaware natives. This next segment is gonna go on for a minute because there's a lot to read and discuss here, but we're going to listen to Ollie's sales pitch that he was using on the native tribes as the missionary force would encounter them. This is actually taken from the footnotes of the History of the Church, Volume 1, page 183 through 85, and it's quite a doozy. There's a lot here to talk about. Quote, on arriving at Independence, 2 of the company secured employment, while the other 3 crossed the frontier and began their labors among the Indians. They visited the Shawnees, spending one night with them, and the next day crossed Kansas River and began their labors among the Delawares. They sought an interview with the chief of the Delawares, known among the whites as Chief Anderson. That sounds like a Native American name, doesn't it? Chief Anderson. Anyway, he was the grand sachem of 10 nations or tribes and consequently possessed large influence. He had always opposed the introduction of missionaries among the people, and therefore did not at first extend a very hearty welcome to the brethren. End quote. I think, just to focus on this real quick here, I find it interesting that earlier in the letter that we referred to, it was talking about the Navajo tribe, who supposedly were some of the most wealthy Native Americans that were, roaming the plains of America. And then here we talk about this Chief Anderson, who was apparently the Grand Chief, or I guess Sachem, or I'm not sure how that word is said, of 10 tribes of Native Americans. So they tend to latch onto the leader, or whoever has the most land and property and the most wealth. I just find that interesting. It seems like it's something worth pointing out there. Quote, however, through an interpreter, the brethren made known their errand and explained to him the Book of Mormon and the information it contained for his people. They asked to be heard before a full council of his nation, a proposition which Chief Anderson took under consideration until the next day. Next morning, the conversation with the Delaware chief was renewed, but he was not inclined at first to call council. But as he began to understand better the nature of the Book of Mormon, he changed his mind and asked the brethren to suspend their conversation until council should be assembled. A runner was dispatched to the tribes, and in an hour 40 leading men were assembled and seated in grave silence to hear the message concerning the book of their forefathers. At the request of the chief, Oliver Cowdery in substance delivered the following address. End quote. Just a side note there that in substance just means that whoever is recording this is recalling it from memory. It isn't exactly a word for word scribing onto a piece of paper as soon as it was happening. Anyway, up to this point, we've just been describing what was happening with the mission trip. Keep in mind, what we're reading right now happened before Ollie wrote his letter to General William Clark to try and gain official access to the native tribes. Ollie and friends were out there proselyting to the Delawares for a couple of days before they were chased out. So let's cover what was actually said in the exchanges with Ollie's speech to the various elders of this Delaware tribe. It's a great insight into Ollie's powerful ability to sell an invisible product, and possibly why Joe teamed up with him in the first place. Joe was a dreamer, Oliver Cowdery was a preacher. Quote, Oliver Cowdery's speech to the Delawares. This is apparently quoting from memory Oliver Cowdery. Aged chief and venerable council of the Delaware nation, we are glad of this opportunity to address you as our red brethren and friends. We have traveled a distance from towards the rising sun to bring you glad news. We have traveled the wilderness, crossed the deep and wide rivers, and waded in deep snows and in face of storms of winter to communicate to you great knowledge, which has come to our ears and hearts, and which will do the red man good, as well as the paleface. Once the red men were many. They occupied the country from sea to sea. From the rising to the setting sun, the whole land was theirs. The Great Spirit gave it to them, and no pale faces dwelt among them. But now they are few in numbers. Their possessions are small, and the pale faces are many. End quote. Okay, hang on here. So that's Oliver's opening line to talking to all of these various leaders of the Delaware tribe. He was saying, so I know that shit is kind of rough right now, and I know that the pale faces are everywhere. And I know that the red man used to be everywhere, kind of like the pale faces are now. And, it really, really sucks. But, there's a reason for it. It was all due to the Great Spirit. Yep, God wanted it to be this way, so that's why it happened this way. So that's why now your possessions are small and the pale faces are many. Sucks to be the red man. Anyway, quote, thousands of moons ago, when the red man's forefathers dwelt in peace and possessed this whole land, the Great Spirit talked with them and revealed his law and his will and much knowledge to their wise men and prophets. This they wrote in a book, together with their history and the things which should befall their children in the latter days. This book was written on plates of gold and handed down from father to son for many ages and generations. End quote. Let me talk about that for a second. So this is talking about the Lamanites and Nephites recording their history on golden plates, and Moroni and Mormon compiling them and all that into the gold plates. I don't know if gold had the same value of commodity to the natives that it has to us nowadays. Because, gold has been a sought-after commodity for a long time, and, it's really pretty and shiny, and a lot of different peoples throughout all of antiquity have really enjoyed gold and have used it as a trading commodity. But I don't know if the natives in their current state really gave half a fuck about gold plates. These people were barely able to survive. Even Oliver said it. Their possessions are small and the pale faces are many. He's saying how much it sucks to be the red man right now because the Native Americans were getting so fucked by all of the pale faces around. So, you really wonder if Oliver saying, this was all recounted in this book of gold plates held that much gravity to the Native Americans that were, listening to this. They probably didn't give half a fuck. Anyway, quote, it was then that the people prospered and were strong and mighty. They cultivated the earth, built buildings and cities, and abounded in all good things as the pale faces now do. You're just rubbing it in, Ollie, aren't you? You guys used to be as awesome as the pale faces are now. I don't know what happened. I don't know why all of you died, because, geez, you guys used to be cool. Seriously, what an asshole. Quote, but they became wicked. Oh, there's the explanation for it. They killed one another and shed much blood, killed their prophets and wise men, and sought to destroy the book. The Spirit became angry and would speak to them no more. They had no more good wise dreams, no more visions, no more angels sent among them by the Great Spirit. And the Lord commanded Mormon and Moroni, their last wise men, prophets, to hide the book in the earth, that it might be preserved in safety and found and made known in the latter day to the pale faces who should possess the land, that they might again make it known to the red men, in order to restore them to the knowledge of the will of the Great Spirit and to his favor. End quote. All right, so this is Oliver's sales pitch here. It must have been more convincing back then because he's just sounding like a primo asshole here. So basically, he's saying that all of the Native Americans that are still alive today sought to destroy this book that was being compiled by Mormon and Moroni. So the Great Spirit, God, got angry with the people and decided to speak to them no more. And then the last wise men that existed, Moroni and Mormon, decided to hide this book in the earth. So that later on, the pale faces can find it, pull it out of the ground, translate it, and then deliver it again to the Native Americans. It's so ridiculous. I mean, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the Native Americans that were just standing around listening to him say these things through a translator and be like, is this guy fucking for real? Are you kidding me? Dude, pass the peace pipe. This guy is fucking insane. All right, let's see here. Let's see if these people are going to consent to the Great Spirit in his favor. Quote, and if the red man would then receive this book and learn the things written in it and do according thereunto, they should be restored to all their rights and privileges, should cease to fight and kill one another, should become one people, cultivate the earth in peace, in common with the pale faces who are willing to believe and obey the same book and be good men and live in peace. End quote. All right. So the argument that Ollie is making here is all of the shit that is fucked up in your guys' world, the reason why all of the Native Americans are dying, are getting killed, they're unable to stand up to the pale faces. I feel like I can say pale face because I'm white. The reason that they can't stand up against them is because God is so pissed off about them getting rid of or ignoring the Great Spirit and trying to, get rid of this book. And all that the natives have to do is convert to Mormonism, and then all of their troubles will go away. They'll be able to regain all of their lands. They'll no longer be fighting and killing one another. The white... Let me say it. The pale faces and the red man can live together in harmony. And they'll all be good men and live in peace. I'm sorry. This is so absurd. You have to wonder what the chiefs really, really thought about what he was saying. It's like, dude, we were living in peace before you assholes got here, and then you showed up and everything went fucking shitty. Thanks to you white faces, you guys are the fucking problem. You are the thorn in everybody's side around here. Oh, God, I love it. I love how pompous Ollie is being here. Quote, then should the red man become great and have plenty to eat and good clothes to wear and should be in favor with the Great Spirit and be his children, while he would be their great father and talk with them and raise up prophets and wise and good men amongst them again, who should teach them many things. End quote. He's about to cross a line here. He's just saying, if you just shape up, if you just follow this magic book that I got in my hand and start wearing magic underwear, you'll have plenty to eat and good clothes to wear, and God will love you again, and the white man's not going to kill you anymore. I can't believe that he's making these arguments. They can't believe him, right? They cannot believe him. There's got to be at least one skeptic in that crowd of Native Americans saying, are you listening to this white motherfucker right here? Are you serious? Is he seriously saying this shit right now? Oh, God. Oh, I love Mormon history. Quote, this book which contained these things, was hid in the earth by Moroni, in a hill called by him Cumorah, which hill is now in the state of New York, near the village of Palmyra in Ontario County." End quote. Okay, I got to stop that for a second, because Mormon apologists today will assert that the hill Cumorah wasn't actually the hill Cumorah, the one that Moroni buried the plates in, wasn't actually the same one that Joseph Smith lived near, which is completely unfounded. There's absolutely no way to assert that, because you have to ignore a lot of different quotes throughout Mormon history in order to possibly claim that they are two different hill Cumorahs. And this just plays further into that idea of, yeah, hill Cumorah is the same hill Cumorah where all of the Nephites died. There was a massive battle of 2 million people that all just killed each other off. That's where Moroni buried the plates. That's where 2 million Native American corpses are hiding under the ground. There's no way to ignore that. It's simply absurd to claim that the hill Cumorah in Palmyra is not the hill Cumorah that's talked about in the Book of Mormon. There's no way to get out from under that point of history. Mormon apologists cannot possibly claim that they are different. Anyway, quote, "In that neighborhood, there lived a young man named Joseph Smith, who prayed to the Great Spirit much in order that he might know the truth. And the Spirit sent an angel to him and told him where this book was hid by Moroni, and commanded him to go get it. He accordingly went to the place and dug in earth and found the book written on golden plates. But it was written in the language of the forefathers of the red men." Oh, so that must have perked up somebody's ears there. "Therefore, this young man, being the paleface, could not understand it. But the angel told and showed him and gave him a knowledge of the language and how to interpret the book. So he interpreted it into the language of the palefaces and wrote it on paper and caused it to be printed. Hallelujah! And published thousands of copies of it to them, and then sent us to the red men to bring some copies of it to them and to tell them this news." Isn't it fucking glorious? "So we have now come from him, and here is a copy of the book, which we now present to our red friend, the chief of the Delawares, which we hope he will cause to be read and known among his tribe. It will do them good." We then presented him with a Book of Mormon. There was a pause in the council and some conversation in their own language, after which the chief made the following reply. End quote. All right, just completely ignoring all of the racist terms there because they were just the usual jargon back then. Ollie started presenting this Book of Mormon to the wise chief of the Delaware tribes. Apparently he was some head honcho that was over 10 different Delaware tribes that were local. And of course, this chief told him to hold off until a large council of Delawares could be called. So a runner was sent out and a whole bunch of wise men gathered together. And at that point, they all listened to the best sermon that Ollie could possibly muster, even given the language barrier. And here is the reply given by the Delaware chief. Reportedly anyway. Quote, "The chief's reply." This is all recounted by Parley P. Pratt from memory. So that's the level of evidence we're dealing with here. It's a first-hand account recorded after it actually happened. Quote, "We feel truly thankful to our white friends who have come so far and been at such pains to tell us good news, and especially this new news concerning the book of our forefathers. It makes us glad in here," placing his hand on his heart. "It is now winter. We are new settlers in this place. The snow is deep. Our cattle and horses are dying, our wigwams are poor, and we have much to do in the spring, to build houses and fences to make farms. But we will build a council house and meet together, and you shall read to us and teach us more concerning the book of our fathers and the will of the Great Spirit." End quote. Okay. So Let me get this straight. Everything that Ollie has been telling these these natives has just been, it sucks to be you because you turned away from the Almighty Great Spirit or God or whatever. And then he goes on to say that as soon as you start reading this book, everything's going to be cool. You're going to stop being killed by all the pale faces. You're going to, everything's going to be better. You're going to have more food to eat, more cattle, more everything. And then the chief's reply is like, dude, we're new settlers to this area and it's fucking winter. The snow sucks around here. Our cattle and horses are dying because they don't have enough fucking grass to eat. Our wigwams are poor because they've been destroyed and we had to move them hastily because we were being chased out and killed by you fucking pale faces. And now you're asking us to build a council house and meet together there so you can read out of this fucking book? Are you kidding me? That's this chief is either the dumbest motherfucker or he is the best satire troll ever in all of Mormon recorded history. He had to be just like, you are not fucking serious with what you're bringing to the table right now. Are you, Mr. Ollie, Cowdung, whatever the fuck your name is? There's no way that people here in this tribe could be taking him seriously. But then, you also think about it, and it's like, these people were beat down. They'd been moved multiple times by the pale faces that were expanding westward and killing the members of their tribe. And then somebody comes along and says, hey, if you read this book, all of your hardships will stop. It's like, you think back to it, what else could they do? It was either that or continue in their shitty existence. And, they ended up just continuing in their shitty existence with a book in their hand. And they're like, great, can I eat this? No? This isn't nutritious? Okay, well, I'm going to use it to wipe my ass. Anyway, quote, Elder Parley P. Pratt, in his report of the matter, adds, we continued for several days to instruct the old chief and many of his tribe. The interest became more and more intense on their part, from day to day, until at length nearly the whole tribe began to feel a spirit of inquiry and excitement on the subject. We found several among them who could read, and to them we gave copies of the book, explaining to them that it was the book of their forefathers. Some began to rejoice exceedingly, and took great pains to tell the news to others in their own language. The excitement now reached the frontier settlements in Missouri and stirred up the jealousy and envy of the Indian agents and sectarian missionaries to the degree that we were soon ordered out of the Indian country as disturbers of the peace, and even threatened with military in case of noncompliance. We accordingly departed from the Indian country and came over the line, and commenced laboring in Jackson County, Missouri, among the whites. We were well received and listened to by many, and some were baptized and added to the church. Thus ended our first Indian mission, in which we had preached the gospel in its fullness and distributed the records of their forefathers among 3 tribes, viz. the Cattaraugus Indians near Buffalo, New York, the Wyandots of Ohio, and the Delawares west of Missouri. End quote. And that was all pulled from the autobiography of Parley P. Pratt, pages 56 through 61, and I took that specifically from the History of the Church, Volume 1. Okay, when I said that the missionary force was altogether unsuccessful with their mission trip to Missouri, I suppose I may have been overstating a little bit. The problem is, this was taken from the autobiography of P. Cubed, which is a fairly biased account, and it's included in the History of the Church, which is an extremely biased account. In some cursory searching, I was unable to find any other evidence of this mission trip going this well. We know that the stop in Buffalo, New York at the Cattaraugus tribe was barely even a stop. They were reportedly kicked out after a day. The stop at the Wyandot tribe in Ohio was a complete failure, as they were chased out mere hours after arrival. Maybe we can speculate that the Delawares were more tolerant of the missionaries, but I think that might be going out on a limb or calling a case of special pleading. Besides, if they did baptize some of these natives, we would have record of their names or the dates when they were brought into the Mormon fold, like we do with almost every other member of the church. And they would have been proud of it, but the history of the church is oddly silent on these Native American names. What's more, if a tribe or even some members of that tribe of natives did convert to Mormonism, it would make headlines all over Missouri and especially through the church. And we would have plenty of other extant sources for it, but I couldn't find any of them in my research. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that these accounts don't exist, but I've been looking around for a while and the search is coming up completely dry. The only evidence we have of these Delawares converting to Mormonism just links back to the same article that we just read, which is contained in the autobiography of P Cubed and the history of the church and not anywhere else. Something that occurred to me during this research is how business was probably conducted between the Native American tribes. Now, I'm only running off of my own naive and uneducated understanding of Native American policy and decorum, but just hear me out for a minute here. When the missionary troop started giving the sales pitch to the Delaware chief, he stopped the sermon, and he told them to wait for the other local chiefs to arrive before continuing their sermon. Only after a runner was sent and there were a bunch of Indian chiefs gathered together did they all sit down and listen to what Ollie had to say. Now, anybody that has ever played that telephone wire game with a group of people knows that messages tend to change the more times they pass from one person to another. So, of course, this game is everybody sits in a circle and one person says a small phrase to another person in the circle. The phrase is whispered from one person to the next until the message makes its way all the way around the circle. By the time it gets back to the person who originally said it, the message has changed dramatically. Oftentimes, the entire meaning has changed with just a few word substitutions or switching a couple of words around. Well, the Delawares probably knew about this phenomenon just as much as everybody else does, so the chief probably wanted all the local chiefs to hear the message straight from the Cowdung's mouth. Once all of the chiefs were gathered, Ollie started into his sales pitch and got to the point in the story about Joseph Smith uncovering the plates and translating them from the language of the natives' forefathers into English. That must have been an amazingly insane idea to this tribe, one that they had obviously never heard before. So Ollie keeps talking about this amazing prophet that lives in the East, and the natives must have been like, so, why the fuck isn't he here to tell us about it himself? I mean, the Delawares had been cordial enough to gather all of their local chiefs to hear Ollie's sermon, but Joe had only sent an emissary to deliver this eternally important message. I mean, talk about egg on the Delaware's face here. These pale faces with some random leather-bound book in hand must have been interesting to listen to say the least, but they were bringing a message of salvation to the, quote, red men, unquote. And the best that the Great Spirit could muster was this weak sauce liaison force of entitled white men whose ancestors had been responsible for fucking killing all of the Delaware's ancestors with their death blankets. I mean, this is absurd. This is where my personal speculation really starts to come into play a lot more. Is it really that hard to imagine that these chiefs asked Ollie to send his chief to deliver the message? I mean, for a second, just put yourself in the Delaware's moccasins here. If you were just living your life thinking you had a pretty firm grasp on reality, and then an alien saucer flew down and landed in your local city park, and outstepped 3 bipedal humanoid-looking beings with green skin, wouldn't that freak you out? Beyond that, what if they tried telling you that they found a copy of the Quran, written in English, buried in the ground on their planet? Wouldn't that blow your fucking mind away? Then, upon inquiry of the claims, you find out that the alien who actually found and translated the book isn't actually there. He's back on planet Gilgar still, and you wouldn't be able to speak with the actual alien that found the book. Your interest would definitely be piqued, but you would still probably be a little bit skeptical until you personally met that alien and saw the original copy of the Quran that it had been translated from, if it were on titanium plates or whatever, and, actually heard that message straight from the horse's mouth, or the chief in that case. Well, I speculate that this is what happened with the tribe, and it served as a small motivating factor to get Joe to make the trek to Missouri himself and go visit the Delawares to convert them himself. But, like I said, this is only speculation, and judging from the records we have, it wasn't a primary motivation for Joe making the trip out to Missouri. If it were a primary motivation, we would have seen that recorded in Divine Revelation or something, and we would have an account of Joe going out to talk Mormon Jesus with the natives, and as far as I can tell, that didn't happen. The primary reason Joe made the trip out there was to make an informed revelation. You might wonder, informed revelation, that's odd. You see, if Joe's revelations were coming from divine authority, the revelations would be completely infallible, and Joe wouldn't require any temporal knowledge to reveal that revelation. That's the basis by which the Book of Mormon was translated. You remember the story here? An uneducated backwoods boy of a mere 14 years old pulled ancient plates from the ground and translated them into a wonderful tome of knowledge known as the Book of Mormon. Joe didn't know shit about fuck if that were the case. And he could have written the most amazing, awe-inspiring book in all of recorded history without even knowing how to write, because he was doing so by the power and gifts of the Almighty God. Of course, none of that happened, and the reported story is deeply flawed in many ways, but the assertion of divinity still holds, and it remains an unanswered discrepancy in what's reported versus what the Book of Mormon actually is. If Joe's revelations were from a source on high, it wouldn't require any personal knowledge to come up with the revelation that we're going to talk about next. This revelation isn't contained in the Book of Commandments, and personally, I'm not sure why. It is, however, in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, but it's just strangely absent from the 1833 Book of Commandments. We're going to read it straight from the 1835 publication of the Doctrine and Covenants, section 27, and it's a revelation given in Independence, Missouri, July of 1831. Joe was in Independence when he gave this revelation. Quote, "Hearken, O ye elders of my church, saith the Lord your God, who have assembled yourselves together according to my commandments. In this land, which is in the land of Missouri, which is the land which I have appointed and consecrated for the gathering of the saints." This is where the informed revelation comes in. "Wherefore, this is the land of promise, and the place for the city of Zion. And thus saith the Lord your God, if you will receive wisdom, here is wisdom. Behold, the place which is now called Independence is the center place, and the spot for the temple is lying westward upon a lot which is not far from the courthouse. Wherefore, it is wisdom that the land should be purchased by the saints, and also every tract laying westward, even unto the line running directly between Jew and Gentile, and also every tract bordering by the prairies, inasmuch as my disciples are enabled to buy lands. Behold, this is wisdom, that they may obtain it from an everlasting inheritance." End quote. There we have it. That was one of the biggest revelations in all of Mormon history. And like I said before, it's an informed revelation because Joe had to be there in order to bring it about. That was the revelation that so many members of the church had been waiting for so long before July of 1831. Hiram Page was chastised for coming up with a revelation similar to that, of which we don't have any copy, and the justification for this chastisement was due to him being led astray by the adversary. This revelation from Joe was all that it took, and so many problems that had arisen in the church before this time could have been resolved before they were even a fucking problem. But no, Joe had to go out to Missouri himself in order to make an informed revelation about Zion and its location that was supposedly passed down by the Almighty God of the universe. That's right. The Almighty Mormon Jehovah Elohim God couldn't give Joe this revelation until Joe got out there and saw the town for himself. Now, I would argue, and in fact am arguing, that God wouldn't need to see independence through Joe's eyes in order to give him this exact revelation. God didn't even need to wait until July of 1831 to come up with the shit. He could have included it in the Book of Mormon. Honestly, if there was a passage in the Book of Mormon that said Independence, Missouri would be the place where Zion, the New Jerusalem, would be built to renew the earth so it can receive its paradisiacal glory, complete with details about how it would be westward on a lot not far from the courthouse, and everything that was contained in that revelation, and Joe had never been to Missouri before, at very, very least, I would give it a good, interesting, and a little bit of thought. But Joe had to go the 800 miles to Missouri himself, even after he had sent a missionary troop there in order to come up with a revelation from Almighty God. Am I the only one that sees this as a huge fucking problem? What does the term prophet mean anymore? Can we just throw it out anymore? It's like, it don't fucking matter. It's just a word. That's all that matters. I mean, is this not just a gaping fissure in Joe's credibility as the one true prophet of God? I mean, Michael de Nostradamus, aka Nostradamus, had exponentially more predictive power than Joe ever did, and he died 5 days short of 278 years before our holy prophet of the latter days. How long until everybody realizes that Joe was just a guy that built a religion and just winged the fuck out of it? He was a poor guy, and he did what he had to in order to survive. I come back to this point all the time on the show, but can we really blame Joe for everything he did? I mean, yes, he was a conscientious deceiver and a father of countless lies, but he was a product of his upbringing and the time and place he grew up in. It's hard to say that he was merely a victim of circumstance because he was a devious genius in so many ways, with absolutely no regard for his fellow men and very little empathy for anybody that he didn't directly love or care about. While it may be hard to say that he was merely a victim of circumstance, it is easy to say that he was deeply influenced by his circumstances. He was intelligent and, most importantly, adaptable to the point of almost psychopathy or even sadism in some cases. I don't think that's something that we can talk about enough, though, is Joe's adaptability to any given situation. He dealt with extreme famine his entire growing up years. He stonewalled through dozens of hardships, financial and otherwise. Joe loved and lost. Recall back to June 1828 when Joe and Emma had their first child. Joe had prophesied before that little Alvin Smith would be the next leader of the church after Joe died. But to everybody's surprise, little Alvin was born with undescribed defects, and he died a few hours after childbirth. This was absolutely devastating to the young prophet. He was a mere 22 years old, and this was a huge tragedy for him to deal with as a young father. This spurred him to temporarily join the Methodist church that the Hale family attended, probably in an effort to seek spiritual guidance and a 19th century equivalent to therapy for the hardships that him and Emma were dealing with. Oftentimes, when a person is overwhelmed by a situation, they will do things to lash out, or they'll just simply run away. Everybody feels those emotions when they're confronted with a tough situation, but each person reacts in a unique way to those pressures. When confronted with tough times, Joe had a habit of running away from his problems. There are countless examples of this, and quite frankly, most of today's episode has been discussing one of those situations. Joe wanted to be a father so badly. He desperately wanted a small version of himself to pass the empire on to once Joe was on his deathbed. Joe and Emma's first child simply wasn't able to survive, and it must have ripped them apart on the inside. So much so that they waited another 2 years before getting pregnant again. Here is where I start navigating into unknown waters, because I'm not a father, and I don't plan on being one, at least not for quite some time. So I have a hard time empathizing with Joe here, which is something that usually comes quite easily to me. I can't even possibly begin to understand the pain and emotional anguish that Joe must have had with the death of Alvin Smith, his first child. I remember watching the movie that's currently playing in the Legacy Theater. There's a scene that it shows Joe somberly digging a hole with tears in his eyes, all while Emma weeps in the background, holding a small child's coffin on her lap. It's a very heavy emotional moment, and I don't think the film does enough justice to the emotions that must have been tearing Joseph and Emma apart while he was burying his own firstborn child. I can't get my head there. No matter how much I think about it, I can't quite get my head in that space, and I'm not sure that I even want to get there. However, I do honestly feel bad for Joe. I feel a deep level of sympathy for him and all of the travesties that he had to deal with. The more that I study Joseph Smith, the more it feels like I'm getting closer and closer to the real Joe. The one thing that keeps me so interested with Mormon history is trying to come to some level of understanding about the young prophet and everything that he went through. Everything we've talked about today happened from March to July 1831. That's the time span we covered. In March, it seemed like everything was fine, and the church was slowly expanding and dealing with new situations as they would arise. But suddenly, in May and June, there's a huge influx of changes in leadership and the biggest push for missionary work the church has ever experienced in its year of operation until that point. Suddenly, it becomes very necessary for Joe to make the trip out to Independence to meet up with Ollie and establish the place where Zion would be built. I don't think that this major shift is without cause. On April 30th, 1831, Emma goes into a premature labor with twins Thaddeus and Louisa Smith. The twins are born, and like some kind of cruel joke, they live for a few hours and then die, just like Alvin had 3 years before that. It was an unimaginable, horrific replay of the most devastating tragedy the young couple had ever experienced, and it happened with 2 children in 1 day. You just can't imagine what must have been going through Joseph's head. We read this earlier. It was in reference to Joe arriving in Missouri and seeing his best friend Ollie after 9 months of separation. Quote, "The meeting was a glorious one, and moistened with many tears." End quote. Was that really because they hadn't seen each other for 9 months? Or is there something more to that? Maybe this whole idea of going to Missouri was just Joe reaching out to the one person that he was closest to, that understood him the most, his old friend Oliver Cowdery. Put yourself for just a second in Sidney Rigdon's shoes, watching this meeting of old friends. You had just witnessed Joe go through the hardest 3 months of his entire life. And you get to stand next to Joe and Ollie as they clutch each other and unleash a torrent of pent-up sadness. Joe must have just hugged Oliver for what seemed like an eternity, weeping uncontrollably, wrapped in the security of his best friend's embrace. Joe wanted to be a father so much, and he had been denied that privilege for the second and third time in one afternoon. But when a door closes, a window often opens, and deaths often come in threes. In trying to empathize with Joe, I can't decide if what him and Emma did in reaction to their dead children was a good thing for them emotionally or not. On the same day that Thaddeus and Louisa Smith died hours after childbirth, a woman named Julia Murdoch died in childbirth. John and Julia Murdoch were good friends of the Smiths, having been some of the first people to join the church. Well, Julia's twins survived their mother in the childbirthing process. Joseph Smith Murdoch and Julia Murdoch Smith were twins adopted by Joe and Emma, as if they were some kind of replacements or something for their own twins that had died on the same day that the Murdoch twins were born, where Julia had died. I don't know how this would have affected Joe and Emma, or what it would have done to their relationship. They had twins of their own that had died, and one of their friends had died on the same day while giving birth to twins of her own. So the Smiths just raised the Murdoch twins as their own children. For lack of better words, what an absolute mind fuck. There are a lot of strong people out there. There are people that can lift a Mini Cooper or drag a freight train. There are people that can bench press 1,100 pounds 15 times in 1 minute. There are plenty of stories out there about somebody whose child is in danger and they lift a car off of them or pry open a mangled metal car doors with nothing but their bare hands. While these examples constitute an amazing level of physical fortitude and seemingly unbelievable feats of physical strength, the mind is where real strength lies. Earlier, I mentioned that I was on the 2 most recent episodes of The Scathing Atheist, wherein Noah and I talked about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. If you want to hear some really disturbing and fucked up behavior that could cause a person to lose sleep at night, listen to the second part of that interview on episode 147 of The Scathing Atheist. At one point, I read a quote after the majority of the massacre had happened, where the children were just wandering around the meadow in an almost trance-like state. Some of them were clinging onto their dead parents. Some of them were pulling their infant siblings out of the arms of their dead mothers, but all of them were very, very damaged. One small infant even had her arm shot almost completely off from a musket ball. Another quote from a woman that took the remaining children in after the massacre said that the infant's arm still oozed from the open wound, but the psychological damage was still worse. The children wouldn't sleep at night. They would just stay awake and wail in sorrow for their parents and family members they had watched the wholesale slaughter of at the hands of Mormon terrorists. These children weren't mentally strong enough and hadn't yet developed the coping techniques to deal with such a horrific and disgusting situation. But I would argue that there isn't a single person on the planet that could witness the slaughter of their entire family and still be able to function normally after that. Human beings can perform amazing feats of physical strength, but only recently have we begun to dive into what mental strength or lack thereof really means? When people are confronted with tragedy, they will oftentimes run away. It's a coping mechanism, and it's worked for a long time. It's not necessarily healthy to run away from emotional problems, but it does temporarily solve the problem, and everybody does it to a certain extent. Well, Joe ran. When shit really, really went wrong, and he had no other solution, he ran. He ran to the arms of the one person that could understand him. The one person that he was closest to. Joe and Ollie had been fighting for control of the church, and, let's face it, Joe had been a DEFCON 3 level asshole to Ollie multiple times. But when it all came down to it, there wasn't a single person on the planet that could help Joe cope with this horrible tragedy better than his best friend Oliver. And maybe that's it. Maybe that's why Ollie couldn't break away from Joe and his church for so long. Maybe that's why he stuck around, because they were emotionally codependent on each other to a certain extent. And Ollie couldn't accept the reality of Joe's two-faced ways. At least until he did accept it and finally acted accordingly. Let's bring the history to a close here, and I'll do so by asking a very simple question. Do you want to know the most fucked up part about what we've been talking about for the last 10 minutes? I'm asking honestly, do you want to know the worst part about this whole child swapping situation? Of course you do. That's why you listen to this show. You're all gluttons for punishment. Every single listener is committing gluttony of watching a man's world completely unravel, and it all happened 180 years ago. It's like a really bad car crash. You just can't look away. Everybody knows how Joe's story ends. We all know he died in 1844 in a jailhouse shootout. We all know that he dealt with incalculable hardships and frustrations, but we don't even know the most fucked up parts yet. Joe is just getting started, as are his innumerable trials and tribulations. But to bring that to a more acute focus, the worst part about everything we've been talking about concerning Joe's adopted twins is what happened on March 24th, 1832. The night Joe was taking care of 10-month-old Joseph Smith Murdoch with the measles. That night, Joe suffered the most horrendous beating of his entire life. And it all facilitates the death of his little baby, Joseph Smith Murdoch. Joe's only son that had been alive for longer than a few hours, that wasn't even his own blood, died at 10 months old. It all leads us to one really big question. Really and truly, how strong was Joseph Smith? Thanks for sticking in there for that bit of a bummer of an episode. I didn't think it was going to end on such a horrible note at the end, but it was just something that I had to include because, god damn, Joe had to deal with some crazy shit. But anyway, let's move on to a slightly lighter note here and talk about Patreon thanks. There's a few new patrons that I had to thank real quick here. We had 2 new NAMO juvenile delinquents to thank. We had Jameson and Jeff. Thank you both very much for your support. I really, really appreciate it. And if you're starting off your path on the long road of NAMO Outer Darkness Kingdom. Next, I had a couple of NAMO adolescent rebels to thank. We had Brian, Sarah, Zimu X Zeno Jr., Nick, and Chris. Thank you all very, very much for your support. I really, really do appreciate that. Your continued support as a patron of the show is really going a long way to help, keep sustainable income for it. So thank you so very much. Next, had to thank the newest NAMO apostate. under the name Heather and Brandon. Heather and Brandon, thank you very, very much for your support of the show. Also, I want to thank you guys personally for your emails and for staying in contact, and also for your book that you guys sent me on the Council of the 50. Holy crap, that is an amazing book. I'm about a quarter of the way into it right now, and my mind is continually blown with every page that I get further into it. So, Heather and Brandon, thank you so very, very much for just being as awesome as you guys are and being very, very active participants with the show. I can't thank you guys enough for it. Really quickly here, I did just want to talk about the GoFundMe page. At the end of the anniversary episode, I set out this goal where if you guys are willing to support me for 6 months of living expenses, I'll put out 2 books. And, the first one's going to be on Mormon history from the birth of Joseph Smith leading up to releasing the Book of Mormon. And the second book will just be a complete deconstruction of the Book of Mormon as much as I possibly can. And I just have to say that this whole GoFundMe is absolutely phenomenal. There has been a massive groundswell of support. In 22 days, the goal is 75% funded, and I'm completely overwhelmed. I cannot thank you guys enough. So I'm just going to list off the names of the people that have donated, and it's just a huge blanket thank you to everybody that was nice enough to do this. So we have Julie, Sarah, Bill, Janice, Jay, Anonymous, Sarai, Tor, good old Tor, Joel, Zimu X Zeno Jr. Thanks for being a patron as well as a supporter. Sean, another anonymous, Tyler, Apostate Jane, Lane, anonymous, Chris Jameson, Eric, anonymous, Paul, Jeremiah, Brandy, Rick, Lori, another anonymous, Daryl, another anonymous, Hal, and Brandon and Heather. You guys are so amazing. When I set out the goal for the GoFundMe, I thought there's no way in hell this is going to get funded. I'm going to continue to have to work my day job and continue to kill myself to put out this podcast. But as it's looking right now here, very soon this thing is going to be completely funded, and I'm going to be able to quit my day job and put out 2 books. And anybody that donates on the GoFundMe page, if you donate over $5, you get a free PDF copy of the books when they're released. Above that, anybody that signs up for Patreon at any dollar amount, anything over $1, you get a free PDF copy of the books when they come out. So, I mean, I'm trying to make this an incentive for everybody to donate to the GoFundMe or to sign up on Patreon, because I'm trying to put the information out there as much as possible. I don't want to put things behind a paywall. I don't want to make a living off of a podcast charging $1 an episode or whatever, because this is information that I feel like can benefit a lot of people, and it doesn't do much good to benefit a lot of people if it's stuck behind a paywall. So I want the information to be as free and available as possible, but the reality is I can't survive off of nothing. I have to, everybody has to have money to survive. And I mean, all of that to say, I'm just so blown away by how generous and how nice everybody has been with this groundswell of support for the GoFundMe and for Patreon. It's just, I cannot thank everybody enough. Just thank you. It's the most gratitude that I've ever had for something in my life ever, and it's the sole thing that I've ever been really, really proud of doing. A year's worth of work of putting in 90 to 100 hour weeks is finally starting to pay off, and it's finally getting to a point where I can decide to do this or to go back to a day job. And the way that it's looking right now, it's going to be the books and the podcast. That's what it's looking like it's going to be. And just to be clear, that's not the only 2 things that I'm working on. I have a few other things coming down the pike, and as details start to come out a little bit more, I'll keep you guys informed on those. As I'm finding out more and more details as these irons in the fire get hotter and hotter, It's going to be a very exciting time. And I mean, I'm just overwhelmed. I can't say thank you enough. I've said thank you like 8 times in the last 2 minutes, and I just cannot thank you guys enough. You guys are the best listening audience ever. I love every one of you guys. Thank you so, so very much. Beyond that, I did want to give everybody a heads up. This episode is going to be released on December 10th, and December 12th through the 13th, I'm actually going to be in Dallas at the Dogma Debate 24-hour Broadcastathon, and David Smalley was nice enough to give David Michael and I an entire hour of intense Mormon history, and I cannot wait to hop on that show. But the thing is with the Broadcastathon is it is a donation-style type of show. So what it is each different, David Smalley has a bunch of different podcasters on, and they each get an hour, and whoever raises the most dollar amount in that hour time frame, of course, wins. And I have absolutely no expectations because I'm asking a lot of you guys to donate to the GoFundMe page or sign up for Patreon, but I would really appreciate it if you guys just listened in during that hour. It sounds like it's going to happen at 1 a.m. on Saturday night or Sunday morning, which is that's Central Time, so 12 noon Mountain Standard Time. That's what I'm on, and that's going to be on the 13th, the 12th, and the 13th, Saturday and Sunday of December, and just. I really hope that everybody listens. If not, it's kind of tough to listen during that hour, and I don't expect to pull in a single penny during that whole hour, but it's still going to be a lot of fun, and I'm going to take a bunch of prepared material. We're going to talk about the Hans Mill Massacre. Everybody knows about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, or knows at least that it happened, but hardly anybody knows about the Hans Mill Massacre that basically spurred the assassination attempt of Lilburn Boggs. So that's what we're going to cover, and it's going to be fantastic. And, hopefully at some other times, David Smalley is going to need a little bit of filler time, and I'll be able to hop on and throw in some other interesting Mormon facts and, what I specialize in, insane Mormon history. So that's all I can say. I'm really excited to fly down to Dallas and hang out there just with a bunch of podcasters and hang out with David Smalley. Really looking forward to it. And, beyond that, I was on an episode of the Zachrilege cast. That was episode 38. I think he just titled it Naked Mormonism or Bryce Blankenegel or something. That was a really fun episode to guest on. Zachrilege there, the Zachrilege podcast he's a funny guy, and he conducts really good interviews, and I had a hell of a time. So there will be a link for that in the show notes. I recommend checking out that Zachrilege cast. Also, there will be a link for Dogma Debate in the show notes as well. Earlier in the episode, I alluded to going on to Scathing Atheist and talking about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Of course, it wasn't the in-depth analysis that I really like to get into, but we did a 2-part interview and covered the Mountain Meadows Massacre. The first part is the siege, the 5-day siege leading up to the massacre, and the second part is just the massacre itself and the aftermath. Quite frankly, that was one of the times that I've had more fun on another podcast doing an interview, just because it was something that I spent time to research beforehand. And, just discussing the Mountain Meadows Massacre is, there's a lot of stuff there that people don't know about, and it's worth listening to. It's worth checking out. So there will be links to episode 146 and 147 of the Scathing Atheist in the show notes, along with links to the other Scathing Atheist crew podcasts, the Skepticrat and God Awful Movies. I've listened to every episode of all of them, and like I said, they're some of my favorite podcasts. The Scathing Atheist crew puts out a hell of a production. That being said, I think that's everything for today. I'm going to do a listener mail segment next time. There was also, I got in a couple of chats that people have been chatting with Mormons, and just keep sending those in, because I'm having a hell of a time reading those and just laughing my ass off at the conundrums and the pretzels that these missionaries are trying to twist themselves into to try and chat with somebody, and then they just get shut down and leave, and then it's somebody else, and they're like, oh, hey, sorry, they had to go. Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, I'm going to go too. It's just, like I said, I'm going to read that in the next episode. It'll be a listener mail segment, and I will cover everything from then on. That's it for the final segment of the show. Just a real quick word from the Secular Outreach Network. If you'd like to find out more information about the Secular Outreach Network, you can go to secularoutreach.com or go to fuckyour.church, where you can find a bunch of other shows that are part of the Secular Outreach Network and have a place to interact with the hosts of all of those shows.
Hi there. This is Matthew the Apostle. Have you been wondering if it was your local pastor that ran away with the church's money? And the deacon's wife? Do you just want to know if it was your rabbi that was arrested for planting a spy camera in the women's bathhouse? Has it ever crossed your mind that it might just be your archbishop that was arrested for fondling children in his care? Or do you just want to know more about the Southern Baptist pastor who was arrested for seeking a little canine carnal companionship? If you've answered yes to any of these questions, you need to listen to In the Name of God, the podcast, your weekly roundup of the most bizarre and hypocritical actions of the people who claim to live the pure and pious life as dictated by their God. In the Name of God, the podcast, the religious news from the Atheist Apostle. A proud member of the Secular Outreach Network, on the web at fuckyour.church.
Before finishing up today, I need to thank a few people. I'll start off by thanking Heretic Woman from the Atheist Apocalypse and Atheists on Air Beyond the Trailer Park for using her voice in the intro. If you'd like to have your voice featured in the intro and your blog or podcast or group plugged, you can find the script on the homepage of the website at nakedmormonismpodcast.com. Simply email an MP3 of you saying those clips and it will be included in the show, just like Heretic Woman did this episode. Thank you to all the patrons who support the show. If you'd like to be as awesome as them, you can go to patreon.com/nakedmormonism to sign up to make a per episode donation. If you can't afford a couple bucks a month, you can always help out the show a bunch by going onto iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast app of choice and leave a 5-star review for the show. It'll only cost a couple of minutes instead of a couple bucks. Thank you to everybody that shares the show through Facebook, Twitter, and other social medias. If you want to get in touch with me directly, email nakedmormonism@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer your questions during the next listener mail segment. Check out the show notes and a lot more information about the show on nakedmormonismpodcast.com. Thanks to Demonista for working so hard on the Facebook page that stays rich with fresh content and lots of interesting, exciting, brand new conversation. Thanks to Jason Camo for his talented musical creation that is used in this show with permission. For more of his amazing musical stylings, you can go to aloststateofmind.com. This has been the Naked Mormonism Podcast, part of the Secular Outreach Network. I'm Bryce Blankenagel, and I would like to thank you, the listener, for lending me your ear. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast.